Welcome to World Religions, a survey of religions course. Part 1, Introduction to Religion and Religious Studies. 1.1, Religious Studies. Religious studies can be defined as the academic study of religion. It's a general term for the field. Another term related is comparative religion, academic study of religion which seeks to improve our understanding of religion by comparing and contrasting different religions. These fields are interdisciplinary. They combine scholarship from multiple other fields, such as anthropology, archaeology, economics, history, philosophy, psychology, sociology, textual studies, and so on. Some of these are social sciences, some of these are humanities, some of these are physical sciences or overlap with such, like archaeology. An example of the contribution of archaeology to religious studies is the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is the oldest known human stone monumental architecture. It's also the oldest known shrine or religious structure, dating from around 9500 to 8000 BC. So insights from archaeologists about the site tell us something about ancient religion. 1.2. What is religion? Religion is difficult to define. As we will see, it is a family resemblance concept. That means it probably cannot be defined in terms of a list of essential properties that all and only religions share. However, we can get insight into the meaning of the word religion by looking at its etymology or history. Be wary when trying to understand a modern term like religion only by looking at its etymology, however, because the meanings of words do change over time. The word religion comes from the Latin word religio, which is the noun form of the verb religare, which means to tie something together tightly or to bind something. This probably was a reference of binding people to the gods through sacrifice and other ceremonies. That's one meaning suggested by the term. Another meaning suggested by the etymology is that religion helps bind people together. Both of these are helpful for understanding what religion is, although they're not the whole story. Here's an example of a modern academic definition of religion from a religious studies scholar, Russell T. McCutcheon. He defines religion as follows: beliefs, behaviors, and social institutions which have something to do with speculations on any of the following: the origin, end, and significance of the universe, what happens after death, the existence and wishes of powerful non-human beings such as spirits, ancestors, angels, demons, and gods, and how this shapes human behavior. A couple things to notice about the definition. One of them is that it's somewhat loose or open-ended. Notice the phrasing, which have something to do with speculations on any of the following. This is probably a good feature of the definition, basically because religion does have fuzzy boundaries. It overlaps with other concepts or phenomena. So a bit more in-depth analysis of this definition. Notice the beginning: beliefs, behaviors, and social institutions. This is sensible as a way of looking at religion. Religion does relate to beliefs, behaviors, and often social institutions. And also in the definition, McCutcheon mentions cosmogony or theories of the origin of the universe, which you often see in religions. Teleology, views about the end or the purpose of the universe. Eschatology, theories of the afterlife. Belief in existence of supernatural beings such as ancestors or gods. And how this shapes human behavior, which I'm interpreting as referring to ethics or moral requirements. This is a pretty good definition of religion. We're going to look at several theories that have been proposed over the years, both essentialist and non-essentialist, before I give my own definition. So to begin with, we can classify some theories of religion in the sense of theoretical definitions. These are definitions of religion being used by scholars that are not the same as a normal linguistic definition. They're not just trying to characterize approximately how a word is usually used, but rather to give a more precise account of the phenomena being referred to by the term. So they're kind of overlapping between a theory and a definition. Essentialist theories of religion, what they all have in common is that they assert religion can be defined in terms of one or more essential properties. Essential properties are those that are necessary or sufficient conditions for a type of thing. Now, this is a kind of philosophical, logical account of essential theories of religion. I'm using this term in the philosophical sense because I'm trained as a philosopher. Sometimes in religious studies, when they talk about essentialist theories of religion, they mean it in the sense of any theory which defines religion in terms of an inner essence, whether psychological or phenomenological. But I think they use the term essentialist somewhat inconsistently or ambiguously. So I'm just going to adopt this philosophical definition of essential and then see what we can glean from it. So here's an example of an essentialist definition from outside of religious studies. A circle is a two-dimensional figure composed of a set of points equidistant from another point. That's basically how a circle is defined in geometry and mathematics. Now, all mathematical definitions and those of other formal systems like symbolic logic are essentialist. So they give you great clarity and precision. Some scientific definitions are essentialist, like the definitions of the elements on the periodic table of elements, all of which can be defined in terms of the number of protons in the nucleus. Hydrogen, for example, it's both necessary and sufficient that an atom have one proton in the nucleus to count as hydrogen. So the point is, a lot of things can be defined in this way, essentially, or in terms of essential properties. Maybe religion is one of those kinds of things, maybe not. There are two main types of essentialist theories of religion. The first type we can call internalist, and the second type we can call functionalist. The first type, internalist, are sometimes called essentialist by religious studies scholars, but this is one of those cases where I think they're using the term essentialist ambiguously, because sometimes by essentialist they just mean internalist, other times they mean this broader philosophical sense of can be defined in terms of some essential properties or other. The second main category of essentialist theories is functionalist. So let's look at each of these types of theories. Internalist theories of religion focus on the inner experience of religion, and they generally imply or assert that when that inner experience is present, that is a necessary and a sufficient condition for something to be religious. Internalist theories often assert that there's both an inner experience and a public expression of religion. And they tend to regard the inner experience as more important, more fundamental, more essential, you might say. The inner experience of religion can be something like faith or belief or the sacred or the holy. The essence of religion, according to these theories, is real, but it's generally thought of as non-empirical. That is, it's not completely observable from the outside perspective using sense perception. And thus, at least to a degree, it will defy academic study, and to a degree must be experienced firsthand. An example is the theorist Rudolf Otto, who regarded das Heilige, or the holy, as the inner essence of religion. These theorists will generally also assert that there's this outer expression of religion that is publicly observable, like the outward behaviors inspired by faith or an experience of the holy, for example. And then the social institutions associated with religion, like churches or sects, are merely secondary and non-essential according to this theory of religion. In other words, for example, if an individual has an experience of the holy, that might count as the existence of an example of religion, even if it's outside any social institution. The second main type of essentialist theory is functionalist theories. These assert that religion is an institution, a social institution, that plays a role in helping individuals, groups, or cultures survive and reproduce. Thus, it performs a function, either individually or socially. So it's saying that religion is a social institution, but the function of it could be either individual or collective or both, depending on the theory. A famous example of a functionalist theory of religion is that of Karl Marx. He basically regards religion as a tool created by the ruling class in a society to facilitate their exploitation of the non-ruling class. In the case of capitalist societies, that would be the proletariat or the working class. Another example of a functionalist theory of religion is that of the sociologist Emil Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, who regarded religion basically as beliefs and practices that enable individuals to form a shared social identity. So that's its function, creating social cohesion and identity. And then another example is Sigmund Freud, one of the founders of modern psychology. Uh, like all of these theorists, he actually had many things to say about religion, so it's a little hard to summarize. But among his main beliefs about religion is that belief in God or a heavenly father is a psychological coping mechanism. So this would be an example of an individualist functionalist theory because the main function of religion is an individual psychological coping mechanism. Religion also helps people vent antisocial anxieties in a way that is non-threatening to their place within the group, according to Freud. So you could regard this as maybe like a secondary function of religion. So you'll notice all of those theories of religion, they do try to define religion as being essentially composed of one or a set of elements. And this is possible. It's logically possible that religion does have an essence, just like mathematical concepts or atoms. But not all concepts are essentialist. There's also what are called family resemblance or cluster concepts. There's a couple of different terms that have a similar meaning. And what they have in common is these are just non-essentialist concepts. They're concepts that can have a definite meaning, but it's one that cannot be fully defined in terms of a list of necessary and sufficient properties. So this idea of a family resemblance concept was actually developed by the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. He did not give a family resemblance theory of religion, so far as I know, but he came up with this notion of a family resemblance concept. Although I believe the term was for it was invented by another philosopher trying to interpret his theory. But family resemblance concepts are ones that lack an essence. This was a significant development in the history of philosophy because if you look at the history of philosophy, most of it has consisted, or much of it has consisted, of trying to give theoretical definitions of concepts, but in terms of an essentialist theory. So it's kind of like a deep presupposition of a lot of older philosophy that this was the proper or the best or the correct way to define things. In many cases, that's actually true, as we see from mathematics and some parts of science. But Wittgenstein pointed out that many, probably most, of the concepts we use in ordinary language don't work this way. They actually cannot be defined in terms of this strict list of necessary and sufficient properties. Rather, things which fit the concept have overlapping patterns of resemblance, like members of a family. They're traits that are shared to a greater or lesser degree by the various things that fit the concept. And thus, there can be greater or lesser degrees of fit with the concept. The main example he gave of this was games. So if you think about it, games have different properties. Most of them are competitions between different people, but not all. Some of them use dice, some of them use a board. There's video games, there's a wide variety of things. So there's probably no list of essential properties that all and only games share. And yet the concept of game is meaningful and definite. It's just not essentialist. So an example of applying a family resemblance theory to try to define religion is Ninian Smart. He regarded religion as a family resemblance concept, and this is Smart's definition of religion. He says that religion is characterized by these 7 dimensions, and the kind of implication here is that these are 7 aspects that you typically see with religion, and the more of these that are present, the more something counts as a religion. So it's a matter of degree. These 7 dimensions he identified are the narrative / mythological, the doctrinal, that is, including things like theology, other theories of God, and so forth, the ethical, the institutional, the material, the ritual, and the experiential. So he's trying to illustrate the multifaceted nature of religion while still trying to say something definite about it. And then to fill out the definition, you'd really have to define each of those 7 elements in more detail. But it gives you the idea of how you go about doing a family resemblance theory of religion. So this is my family resemblance theory of religion. It's not that original, to be honest. I'm just riffing off of Smart and other work by religious studies scholars identifying important aspects of religion. And this definition could probably be improved maybe by adding other factors or just defining them slightly more precisely. I'll get to the definitions of each of these 9 properties in the next slide. But the point is, you can define religion as a set of beliefs and behaviors characterized by the following 9 properties, where the more of these that are present and the greater degree to which they are present, the more the set of beliefs and behaviors counts as a religion. So these are the sacred, the supernatural, myth, symbol, ritual, sacrifice, morality, social, and mysticism. In order to make this definition somewhat helpful, you really have to define each of these 9 properties. So the sacred is something that has meaning or value that transcends the ordinary. In philosophy, we might define this as lexically prior value. That is, value that's categorically more important. It outweighs things of lesser value, so you can't trade off one or the other. Now, some theorists have been tempted to define religion purely in terms of the sacred, but there are examples of sacred value or meaning outside of religion. Like, for example, there are non-religious people who might think that the life of their child has sacred value, or that their country, their fatherland, their homeland, their motherland has sacred value for them. So there do seem to be sacred value or meaning outside of religion as well. The second salient or important property of religion is the supernatural, something that has powers beyond that of the natural world. So religions almost universally have at least some supernatural beliefs in them. A third salient property is myth. So religions have stories that focus on expressing meaning and value rather than only on literal accuracy. Religious people can regard their stories as also literally true, but their importance is not exhausted by the fact that they're literally true, typically. The fourth salient property is symbols, using one thing to suggest or express another meaning. A lot of religious rituals, for example, use symbols. Ritual is a fixed sequence of behaviors that has a meaning or purpose, also very important for religion. A sixth salient property of religion is sacrifice. And this is significant because there are a lot of other social phenomena that are similar to religion. But one of the ways you can mark them off from religions is that often those other phenomena, like for example, some types of New Age belief or practice, or New Thought belief or practice, they don't have the element of sacrifice, which is giving up something of value as a sign of commitment. It could include something like animal sacrifice or giving money, like tithing to a church, or taking vows to abstain from things that you like fasting. All these kinds of things can be sacrifices. A seventh salient property of religion is morality. So religions generally have views about moral value, the good, the right, and virtue. In philosophy, we think of ethics as largely consisting of judgments about these three things: the good, which is what is a goal worth pursuing; the right, which is how we evaluate actions as being correct or incorrect, morally speaking; and virtue, which is how we evaluate states of character, such as honesty or dishonesty, which are either of positive or negative moral value. So religions generally have teachings and rules related to morality. An eighth salient property of religion is social. So religious beliefs and behaviors are often formed and performed in groups of people. So something is less religious to the extent that it's a purely solitary belief system or practice. And ninthly, religions typically have mysticism. This is a somewhat broad category, but it's a way of referring to experiences of self-transcendence, and we might add beliefs and practices associated with that. And this may include union with a sacred or supernatural being. So hopefully now you have a better understanding of religion based on some theories and definitions that have been used by various scholars. And you can have disagreements about the best way to understand religion. That's something that's still debated, I would say, nowadays. There's probably a rough consensus around the type of definitions given by Smart, myself, and McCutcheon. They do tend to be somewhat open-ended. That can be a feature rather than a bug. But yeah, this is something I think there could still be reasonable disagreement about. But what we're going to do now is start to look at the secular and scientific study of religion. What are some of the main insights, some of the main themes, or some of the main assumptions or methodologies that have been used by academics to study religion? And as we'll see, it actually is a mixed bag. Even though I myself am an academic, trained as a philosopher, and I do think there's value in academic scholarship of religion and other things. We always have to be careful because scholars themselves will bring theoretical assumptions into their research. They'll bring ideologies. They may have axes to grind, or they can just be limited in terms of their information or perspective. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a mixed bag. We don't want to just naively accept everything that every researcher has said about religions, but nor do we want to just completely ignore it or reject it. There's probably some insights buried in there as well. The secular study of religion, which means the study of religion outside of theology, outside of people trying to defend or critique religions from a particular religious perspective, started in the Age of Reason, the 17th century, and the Enlightenment, the 18th century in Europe. The Age of Reason is so named basically because it was the period in which modern science originates. The earliest sciences include astronomy, physics, and chemistry. Um, Basically, you can think of science in the modern sense as involving things like the experimental method, using mathematical models to develop quantified theories rather than just vague qualitative theories, trying to gather data in a systematic way and quantify it, use it to test and improve theories, mathematical models, and so on. So it turns out the modern science itself is probably a family resemblance or cluster concept. So we don't need to obsess overly on how we define it. It probably can't be defined completely essentially. But the point is, most of us have an idea of what modern science is, and it's different from the old science, including that used to analyze and defend religion previously, like theology and philosophy. There was a new method more based on empirical observation, experiment, and mathematical models. The Enlightenment was a cultural movement that included scientists, but also writers, artists, other thinkers, uh, politicians, and it originates in the 18th century. The Enlightenment, what most characterizes it, is questioning of traditional religious and political authorities and beliefs and practices, and seeking to reform society based on reason, based on science. So, trying to give a rational critique and improvement of many different aspects of human society. Voltaire, a French philosopher, is a famous figure from the French Enlightenment. The secular study of religion really begins during the Enlightenment era. It attempts to question religious belief and to understand religion as a natural phenomenon, as a product of human belief and behavior, rather than divine revelation. Hitherto, thus before the 17th and especially before the 18th century, religion was just assumed by most scholars and scientists. If they privately questioned it, they typically wouldn't write down all of their critiques, or they wouldn't try to approach religion from a neutral scientific perspective. This is a novel take on religion that grows during the Enlightenment, where social sciences like economics are starting to develop, and people are starting to think, oh, let's also look at human society and culture from a secular, that is, a worldly, or from a scientific perspective. So this is something new. And a lot of the figures in the Enlightenment, they were either questioning the Catholic Church or a particular church in their country if they weren't Catholic. They were questioning Christianity. Some of them were deist, which is people who believe in a supreme being, but one who does not interfere miraculously in the creation. The deist view is that there's one God who creates the universe, but he creates natural law to govern the universe and thus doesn't break the natural laws by performing miracles. So deists are non-Christian, at least in the conventional sense. There were also atheists or agnostics, typically not self-designating, but they existed as part of the Enlightenment. So a lot of these people are questioning or critiquing Christianity, and they're looking for other ways of explaining nature or reality or themselves. And part of that critical perspective is looking at Christianity and other religion and trying to understand it from a scientific or at least a rational point of view. So Voltaire, the previously mentioned French philosophe or philosopher, critiqued the Catholic Church, for example, although he was a deist. So we can distinguish between the secular and the scientific study of religion. Secular just means worldly or not from a religious perspective. So the secular study of religion doesn't have to be scientific in the sense of having the experimental method, having systematic empirical observation, having mathematical models like equations in theoretical physics, for example. Science, more properly speaking, should involve at least some of those things. Empirical observations, systematically collected and analyzed, testing hypotheses through experiments, and mathematical modeling, ideally. So we can define the scientific study of religion as attempting to describe or explain religion using the scientific method, which involves forming and testing empirical hypotheses and expressing such hypotheses and data quantitatively. And we must immediately note that a lot of the early allegedly or putatively scientific theories of religion are not actually scientific in the proper sense. They're quasi or partially scientific, or sometimes even pseudo-scientific. They claim to be scientific, like arguably Marxist theories, but they are not actually scientific in the normal sense of the term. Now, we should be a bit cautious here. Just because something is non-scientific doesn't mean it's false. Like, for example, I'm a philosopher, and in philosophy, we don't generally follow the scientific method, it doesn't mean everything we say is false or worthless. So too, mathematics. Mathematics is not an empirical science. They don't do experiments. They don't have testable hypotheses in the same sense in which they do in empirical science. They have mathematical proofs, which are different from experimental proofs and how they work logically. So there's lots of non-scientific ways of knowing, but at the same time, we should treat these early quasi or pseudo-scientific theories of religion very cautiously. They're more of just like conjectures or speculations or opinions. They're not usually based on rigorously collected data or hypotheses that have been confirmed through observation and experiment. So, having said all that, here are some early examples of a scientific study of religion. Karl Marx, the economist, Emil Durkheim, the sociologist, and Sigmund Freud, the psychologist. Marx regarded religion as an ideology supported by the ruling class to control the masses. He regarded religion also as an expression of protest by the people. He called it, quote, sigh of the oppressed creature, unquote, and as something that dulls pain, quote, the opium of the people, unquote. So in other words, it performs a genuine psychological function. But the problem with religion is that it changes nothing socially or economically speaking, and it promotes people's acceptance of their exploitation by the ruling class by promising a resolution for their unjust treatment in the afterlife, which according to Marx doesn't actually exist. It's just a lie told by the elites to oppress the people. Religion, according to Marx, also gives the locus of control to God, prevents the oppressed from improving their lot. In other words, it encourages people to think that God is in control of the world and human society, not the people being oppressed. And so it's part of the ideology that keeps them oppressed and trapped. And Marx also believed that religion will disappear when the oppression of the working class ends. And he also thought that that would happen, presumably sometime within his lifetime through a worldwide revolution. So you can see there are a bunch of descriptive elements of religion here, some of which may have some truth to them. But I think it's a kind of temptation to go along with a theory like Marx's. It's a somewhat simplistic narrative. It reduces all of religion to one thing. And you can actually find counterexamples to this account. For example, even highly egalitarian societies, like those of traditional Australian Aborigines, which don't have a ruling class and a subject class, even they have religious beliefs and practices. Forms of animism, basically, or worship of many spirits. So I think that's just one example that goes against Marx's theory, and you can probably find a lot more. Another thing is that even though communist regimes, when they took over, did try to eradicate religion in countries like Russia and China, they have not been fully successful. And so you might also regard that as a counterexample to Marxist theory that religion will disappear when the oppression of the working class ends. Although there's the further complexity of to what extent those communist regimes actually ended the oppression of the working class. But I've already talked about this a bit, but I want to summarize some of the caution we should have when we're learning from the scientific study of religion. I do think, in general, religious studies and many of the particular disciplines it uses, like sociology and anthropology, can give you genuine insights into religion. So it's a useful resource for understanding religion. But there's going to be limitations as well to the whole enterprise we're engaged in. Many of the putatively, allegedly, that is, scientific theories are, as discussed, actually pseudoscientific or only quasi-scientific. Another example, Freud, his psychology is non-quantitative, non-experimental. He did not use the scientific method in developing his theories, even though he regarded himself as giving scientific theories of the mind. Also, as well, that of his student Carl Jung, about which more later. Scientific study can also be hindered by excessive or unreasonable theoretical presumptions or methodologies. So you see this especially in the social sciences, like sociology, anthropology, economics, and so on, although not exclusively in those. So, for example, someone may be coming from a ideological or theoretical background like Marxism, or critical theory or postmodernism. And if they're using this theory as a filter to study religion or other phenomena, it's going to really color their perspective. So, Marxism, we already discussed briefly. It's the theory that human societies are mostly characterized by this oppression of a subject class. In the case of industrial societies, the proletariat or the working class. And so you have to understand all social phenomena, including religion, in terms of that pattern of economic exploitation, that pattern of economic power relations. Critical theory and postmodernism we'll talk about a bit more later. Critical theory is essentially a later version of Marxism, which also analyzes power dynamics in culture and other areas of society apart from economics narrowly construed. Postmodernism is a philosophy that, to briefly characterize it, denies there is such a thing as a single, universally correct, objective narrative. It adopts what has been referred to as a hermeneutic or method of interpretation of suspicion, that is, being suspicious of grand narratives. And so they might try to deconstruct or pull apart various religious narratives. Keep in mind, though, postmodernism itself is a theoretical presupposition, an absolutist one in its own way. And then we can also look at other aspects of scientific study of religion, methodologies that might limit it. So, purely qualitative research doesn't use mathematical models, doesn't collect quantified empirical data. This is not necessarily inherently useless because there can be a lot of stuff that you capture through qualitative observations and recordings, like speech, like writing, that are useful for understanding religion. But it's going to be inherently less precise and less testable, less verifiable or falsifiable than genuine science. And then scientism. This is kind of like a worldview that is variously defined, but in general, it looks at science as the best form of explanation and knowledge, as giving the best ways of understanding reality. And scientism also tends to be materialistic, to think that the material or physical world is the only one. And this could well be true, but two things. First of all, not all types of knowledge is or should be scientific. Like, just an obvious example, mathematical knowledge, knowing a theorem through mathematical proof. Strictly speaking, that's not using empirical science, and yet few people would deny it's a genuine form of knowledge. And we also have other types of knowledge, such as knowledge from our everyday experience, and maybe phenomenological ways of knowing. So knowing that's based on our experiential perspective. It's one way of thinking about that. And so scientism is probably overly constrained. This could be relevant if you assume a scientific worldview or methodology. You'll just kind of beg the question or assume without argument that religious ways of knowing and understanding are false. So science, in other words, can be hamstrung by some of these theoretical presumptions and methods. There's also the ever-present possibility within science of fraud, negligence, bias, and poor scientific method. This is not to say that science is uniquely or especially problematic. It's that even though science is a great source of knowledge, including of religion, we can't just blindly trust any given scientific study, or sometimes whole fields of research are tainted in various ways. So there's a lot of evidence that scientific findings, some of them are fraudulent. There's, a certain percentage of studies published in peer-reviewed journals that contain, fraudulent data and things like that. Even when scientists or people publishing their work are not deliberately committing fraud, they can make errors, whether through neglect or through bias. The foremost example of which is confirmation bias, so only seeking to collect, present, and or publish evidence that supports a theory that you like rather than any evidence that contradicts it. Publication bias can consist in wanting to publish new or surprising results or interesting results rather than results which are not new, not surprising, or not interesting, even if they're correct. And we should take those results in mind when forming our view of religion or other things. P-hacking is an example of poor scientific method, essentially examining a data set for any correlations it might have, even though there's a substantial chance, if you examine enough potential correlations, that some will appear through chance alone. And thus, if you're doing that method to find correlations in data, you're going to find and perhaps publish a bunch of coincidental correlations, as opposed to those which are more persistent across multiple data sets. And then an example of the limits of scientific study is the replication crisis in social psychology and other social sciences, which basically is the fact that many such studies in social psychology and other areas where this is kind of spread to or expanded to have failed to replicate when they are retested by independent researchers. So a couple things about this. Number one, it doesn't even mean that the initial findings were false. Not all of them probably are. But the fact that a large number fail to replicate means that at least a significant fraction of those initial findings were probably inaccurate. A second thing is that this is probably not unique to social psychology or social science generally. Those were the first fields where this was discovered, but that's just the first fields where researchers tried to systematically replicate some of the past findings. And so it probably exists to a certain degree, one degree or another, in all scientific fields. If you tried to replicate research that's considered established, a significant fraction of it, you might say, would probably fail to replicate, even though the percentage probably varies from discipline to discipline. So all this is not to get you overly down on science. Science is amazing. It's given us knowledge of many things, including religion, that we otherwise wouldn't have, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. 1.4, Sociology of Religion. Sociology is defined as the scientific study of society. After economics, you could probably regard it as the second oldest social science. Early sociology of religion was often explicitly or implicitly critical of religious beliefs, practices, and institutions, in particular the Catholic Church. So this is because a lot of those early social scientists, figures like Auguste Comte and Emile Durkheim, were part of or influenced by the Enlightenment movement. And they have a secular worldview, and many of them, like Comte in particular, were themselves personally critical of Christianity and the Catholic Church in particular. So this is going to inform their perspective on religion. This was true probably of much of sociology of religion in the 19th and much of the 20th centuries. I think it's fair to say that in the last few decades, much contemporary sociology of religion lacks the same overtly critical stance of earlier such study. But generally, sociology of religion still attempts to understand religion as a social construct and to analyze religion in terms of social processes. Thus, it kind of assumes, at least methodologically, that religious beliefs are not grounded in supernatural truths. Sociology of religion, as well as, I think it's fair to say, much social science of religion, often adopts what you could call methodological agnosticism. This is studying religious beliefs sociologically or scientifically without deciding whether they are true. And I think this can be indeed very helpful, just at least as a preliminary step, even if what you are most personally concerned with is whether a religion's beliefs are true. In order to maximally understand what the beliefs are before evaluating them, it can be very helpful to adopt this methodological agnosticism, just to try to get clear of what the views actually are before you try to prematurely judge them for truth or evaluate them in some other way. The term agnosticism was coined by the 19th century figure Thomas Henry Huxley to mean it's not known whether God exists, and he was a believer in agnosticism. However, the term methodological agnosticism was not coined by Huxley. It's a term used by sociologists to help just characterize their approach to religion. They don't have to presume one way or the other whether a particular religion's views are true. They just try to study them neutrally and objectively. Unlike sociology and other scientific study of religion, theology and philosophy of religion do discuss questions of religious truth. So, for example, they may analyze, evaluate, critique, or argue on behalf of different arguments for whether God exists, whether there's an immortal soul, whether there's an afterlife, and so on. But some sociologists have argued that recognizing the falsity of at least some religious beliefs is actually necessary to understand how they function sociologically. And you might think of something like Karl Marx's maybe proto or quasi-scientific analysis of religion as a kind of extreme example of that. Maybe in order to understand how religious beliefs are operating socially, you actually need to understand that they're false. Regardless, I think that even if it's not the whole story or the only method, methodological agnosticism can be a helpful tool for at least a certain stage of the scientific study of religion. So there are many different sociological theories of religion, and there's kind of a fuzzy boundary, at least I would argue, between a definition of religion and a theory of religion. Definitions in general are towards the side of just understanding what the term means. More substantive theories give you additional insight in terms of how the entity or entities referred to by a term operate or function causally. Now, I personally think there's a lot of overlap between these two, which is why you'll see probably some overlap between our previous discussion of definitions of religion and now more substantive theories of what religion is or how it operates. The first type of sociological theory of religion you could call individualist theories. These conceive of religion as being rooted in individual persons' needs or drives. We can divide individualist theories themselves into two main categories, cognitive and emotional. The cognitive theories are going to focus on religion as ways of understanding or explaining. The emotional theories are going to focus on religion as ways of relating to or coping with emotional needs or drives. Intellectualist theories look at religious belief as a pre-scientific attempt to understand the world and human experience. We can classify Auguste Comte into this category, as well as some other figures from the 19th and early 20th century study of religion. Not all of these are sociologists, by the way, but Herbert Spencer, Edward Burnett Tyler, and James G. Fraser can all be classified to one degree or another as having cognitive or intellectualist theories of religion. You'll notice right away that they're only focusing on religious belief, not religious practice, not religious institutions so much, social institutions. That right there may be a limiting factor for how much of religion they can explain. Many people who advocate intellectualist or cognitivist theories of religion also hold to what's called the secularization thesis. This is the proposition that religion will be supplanted by science and the future will be secular or non-religious. This would make sense if the main reason why religion exists is because it's giving people pre-scientific explanations of the world and human experience. If those are replaced by scientific explanations, then you would suspect religion to go away. Emotionalist theories, by contrast, think of religion as stemming from emotions such as fear, uncertainty, ambivalence, and awe. And religions are attempts to cope with intense emotional experience, rather than being attempts to explain or understand reality. Sigmund Freud's theory of religion as a psychological coping mechanism fits into this category, as do the sociological theories of Robert Ranulph Merritt and Bronislaw Malinowski. And the emotionalist theorists would not necessarily agree with the secularization thesis, because even if people have better scientific explanations of the world and of their own experience, if they still have these emotional needs, why then religion could still exist there to help them fulfill those emotional needs. The second main type of sociological theories of religion are collectivist theories. These conceive of religion as being rooted in social processes. Emile Durkheim's theory is one example. Durkheim regarded religion as performing an essential social function, as helping to integrate and unify society. He thought that religion binds society together into a moral community. Religion is the expression of the individual's subordination to society. It does, in a sense, oppress the individual, but Durkheim thought that religion was actually necessary for society to function. So even though Durkheim himself was not a religious believer, he thought it was socially useful. He also thought that individuals don't understand social forces, and so they can use religion to help explain them. For example, even though according to Durkheim, God does not exist, and it is society, not God, that forces the individual to conform, somehow psychologically people can understand or accept the necessity of this process through the idea, the concept of God. Durkheim also had a theory of collective rituals. You'll notice that in most religions, people perform rituals together, such as going to Mass, such as chanting, praying, singing hymns together, dancing together, and so on. Through these rituals, according to Durkheim, people reaffirm their belief in supernatural beings, but also they reinforce their social bonds thereby by coordinating their literal physical actions, but also their emotions and their ways of thinking. Religion is a projection of society's highest values and goals, again, according to Durkheim. The realm of the sacred is separate from the natural world, but through religious enculturation, you might say, is made to seem natural and necessary to people, even though, according to Durkheim, it's just pure fantasy, basically. So his work, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, written in 1912, has one of his most famous quotes about religion. Quote, "Religion is society worshiping itself," unquote. So you can see there his double-sided view of religion. On the one hand, it's based on a lie, or you could say just on an illusion, this misbelief in supernatural beings like God, but it also is performing this essential function, on the other hand, of constituting society. A third type of sociological theory of religion we could call synthetic. This is my term. I'm not sure it's used within sociology itself, but there have been many later sociological approaches to religion that are attempting to synthesize intellectual, emotional, and social factors, giving, in a sense, recognition that all of these are part of religion. A fourth type of sociological theory of religion is called meaning theory. And this regards religion as giving purpose and significance to human life and society in the face of suffering and injustice. Religion, according to this theory, explains and justifies things like good and bad fortune based on a world that goes beyond sense perception, such as an afterlife to punish and reward, to compensate for worldly injustices, for example. Max Weber is often regarded as an early example or proto-example of this approach to understanding religion. In his work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and in 3 in-depth studies of world religions, including Buddhism, that he conducted, there's kind of an overall method of focusing on the ideas of religion, taking them seriously for how they shape and color people's worldviews. And I think that's why his name is often associated with the development of meaning theories of religion in sociology. And a fifth, more recent type of sociological theory of religion is the rational choice theory. This draws from economics. Rational choice theory treats people as rational agents who attempt to maximize their utility or subjective value. The sociologists who've adopted this perspective, there are only a few of them, I think, but they published an anthology, I think it was back in the 1990s, that kind of kicked off this paradigm. They tend to treat religions as rival products offered in a market of religious organizations. A couple of critiques that have been given against this theory. Most people don't actually choose their religion and are instead socialized into them. This is certainly true historically. So if you go back in human history, almost all people that have a religion, they just get it from their parents, their family, their community. They don't choose it, whether deliberately or subconsciously. So the RCT theory might fit to a certain extent modern diverse societies that have a lot of religions on offer and where there isn't huge social pressure against converting to a different religion, like in the United States. But this is actually, sociologically speaking, somewhat unusual. If you look at the full history of humanity, and even if you look at the whole world today, there's a lot of societies that are much more tight, closely organized, and don't give individuals the same options to choose in or to opt out of a religion. Religions also impose heavy costs on their members. I mean, some people even die for their religion, they become martyrs. So that's hard to make sense of in the rational choice theory because that would generally be regarded as not maximizing utility. I mean, there could be some counterexamples to that. But even other practices involving sacrifice, like tithing, giving 10% of your income, just giving a lot of other resources, time, money, etc., to the religion. It's not impossible to explain on RCT theories, but it's at least a puzzle for them. And another factor, I'm not sure that any of the RCT sociologists of religion have done this type of analysis, but in economics, there's a sharp distinction between what is individually rational and what is collectively rational. Collectively rational means it maximizes the utility of a group of people, whereas individually rational means it maximizes the utility of an individual. So it actually might be easier to understand religion in terms of something that's collectively rational. For example, if it helps bind communities together, as a lot of theorists of religion have suggested over the years, it might help them cooperate against other groups, against common enemies. There could be other factors too. If religion increases social trust in the society, it could make the society as a whole just better off. If there's like less crime or violence or something like that, if there's more trade because people trust each other. And so there could be various factors that help the society flourish or compete. We're getting into controversial waters here, stuff like group selection and evolutionary biology, or cultural evolution, which is kind of like a new social science paradigm, but still pretty controversial. But the point is, it might be easier to make sense of how religion is collectively rational rather than how it's individually rational, even though I think the initial sociological RCT theories focused on individual rational analysis. And then with regards to this idea of rationality, we could also invoke signaling theory. So a signal is a communication of information that has some cost being paid to make the communication. And the fact that the person or the agent pays a cost to send the signal is significant because in general it will increase its credibility. So a costly behavior like a self-sacrifice, or like in the case of the story of Abraham, who was ordered by God to sacrifice his son Isaac to God, the fact that Abraham was willing to do that, even though God at the end of the day didn't make him do that, is a credible sign that he was sincere in his commitment to God. And similarly, the sacrifices of religion might be interpretable, at least in part, in terms of signaling theory, that individuals need to pay a cost to show credibly to other people and their religious community that they can be trusted because they sincerely believe in the religious entities on behalf of which they're making a sacrifice, just as an example of how that could work psychologically and socially. And without the sacrifice, someone could easily say that they're committed and that they will follow God's laws, but that could be just what's called cheap talk in game theory, another mathematical theory that's used a lot in economic analysis. So in other words, there could be something here in how we understand religion, but there could be layers of this, both individual and collective rationality. And again, it might not be the whole story. So let's get back to the secularization thesis. This can be defined as the proposition that religion is declining in modern industrial societies and losing social significance. A couple of things about this. Already you can see this is a slightly different proposition than the way I defined it previously. So there's actually different versions of the secularization thesis. Moreover, insofar as the thesis is stated qualitatively, is declining, that tells us something, but it's not a more precise quantitative hypothesis, and thus it's going to be harder to test. How much does religion have to be declining, and over what time frame, in order for it to count as a verification of the secularization thesis? I think there's also a huge ambiguity between two different broad categories of secularization thesis. I'm a philosopher, so I like to make distinctions, and this is not always done, unfortunately, systematically in sociology or some other disciplines. But at the very least, I think it's helpful to distinguish between what you could call the extreme secularization thesis and the moderate secularization thesis. The extreme secularization thesis would be something like religion will completely or almost completely disappear from society in such and such time frame. The moderate secularization thesis will be religion will decline within such and such a time frame. And in order to test the secularization thesis to see if it has held true or will hold true, you at least, I think, need to distinguish between the extreme and the moderate forms of that. Historically, if you go back to the 19th and much of the 20th century, a lot of sociologists and just other scientists generally believed in the secularization thesis. They thought, going back indeed to the Enlightenment, the 1700s, that it was just natural or inevitable that society would become much less religious and that religion would probably eventually disappear and be replaced by a purely scientific ideology or something like it. So I think a lot of people believed in the extreme secularization thesis. Now, the one bit of vagueness or wiggle room there is that they didn't always give a time frame by which this should be accomplished. But I think it is fair to say that on a lot of people's expectation of the time frame, the extreme secularization thesis has been falsified because religion is still with us even in modern developed societies. And so a lot of sociologists nowadays will question or criticize the secularization thesis. However, a couple of huge caveats we need to make about that. First of all, that's only the extreme secularization thesis that has been pretty well falsified. Um, and the moderate secularization thesis is something else. Secondly, if we just think that the secularization thesis is obviously false, we're missing a hugely important fact, which is that traditional religion has declined and is declining precipitously, significantly, in other words, in modern developed societies. Even since the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, church attendance is way down, for example. So I think there's been significant verification of the moderate secularization thesis, at least some versions of it. But this is where we have to get to making the thesis more precise before we can test it scientifically. A lot of contemporary sociologists will point to various modern phenomena for being reasons for why they reject the secularization thesis. For one thing, if you look at developing nations, those that are, for the most part, developing economically, but still have a lot lower GDP, gross domestic product per capita than developed nations. So, for example, if you look at a lot of the nations in sub-Saharan Africa, they're still developing, unlike nations in Europe or North America or parts of East Asia like Japan and South Korea. Those would be the more economically advanced or developed nations. While most of the developed nations have seen real shrinkages in religion, religious identity, religious participation, religion is still strong and even growing in some ways in a lot of the developing nations. And a second factor is that particular types of religion, especially fundamentalist sects of Christianity, Islam, forms of Judaism that might be classified as fundamentalist, like ultra-Orthodox, some traditionalist forms of Hinduism, they've grown, they're still quite strong. In fact, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the fastest growing religions are Pentecostal Christianity and fundamentalist Islam. So there have also, thirdly, been some new religious movements that are called NRMs by social scientists that have grown up even in developed nations. So as those nations have become less religious, more secular, there's been a kind of growth or bloom of new religious movements, sometimes called sects or cults, but the point is they're not rooted for the most part in traditional religions, and they've actually grown. The thing about that, though, is that they still make up a tiny fraction of the population in developed nations. So they're even less of a counterexample to the secularization thesis than the previous 2 points mentioned. And then fourthly, social scientists might point to the growth of what you could call quasi-religions, or things that are similar to religions in some ways, even though they don't really fit the definition of religion, as evidence against the secularization thesis. This, I think, is actually the weakest evidence against the secularization thesis, because you're basically taking as evidence things that aren't even religions. So this is where it gets really important to define your terms, be consistent, and also to define the thesis under discussion sufficiently precisely so we know what counts as evidence for or against. Arguably, someone who believes in the secularization thesis can fully embrace and indeed emphasize the growth of these so-called quasi-religions as being consistent with and even a part of the truth of the secularization thesis, i.e., maybe people are turning away from religions and finding meaning in other non-religious social phenomena. So in other words, this alleged evidence against secularization thesis could actually be evidence for. But here are some examples of things that have replaced religion in a lot of people's psychology and in their social identity and behavior. Nationalism, sports, celebrities, especially being really obsessed with a celebrity like Taylor Swift or Kanye West. We could name a bunch, no aspersions cast on Swifties and so on, by the way, just naming some examples. Psychotherapy as an alternative way of understanding your life and your relation to the world, etc. The self-help movement, various spiritual aligned movements that don't probably qualify as full religions. Spiritualism, which focuses on summoning and communicating with spirits of the dead, like through seances and the like. It started in the 1800s in the U.S. The New Thought movement, which was a movement still kind of around, but in the 1800s that taught the idea of you could summarize it as mind over matter, that thought determines reality. So you change your thought, you change your reality. And then the New Age movement, which started in the 1960s and 70s as part of the broader counterculture movement. A lot of these have religious aspects to them, but they tend to lack the sacrifice, the moral codes, the consistent ritual, and the social organization of genuine religions. Alternative and complementary medicine, political ideologies as kind of substitute religions. There's been a lot of social science research on this. People now derive much more of their personal identity through which political party they identify with and other political issues more than their religious identity than previously. Moral ideologies such as deep ecology or the effective altruism movement, a lot of people have similar degrees of moral commitment to these as they would have in the past have had towards religion. And then various types of literature, media, games, and fandoms, such as anime, manga, video games, cinema, television, people getting obsessed with other worlds, like Tolkien's Middle-earth, the Marvel series, Game of Thrones, all this kind of thing. It fulfills their imagination. It gives them symbol and fantasy, similar in a way to people previously got from religion. But arguably, all of these don't count as religions. And so, again, the fact that people are moving to these may be consistent with at least the moderate version of the secularization thesis. By the way, in the picture, it's from the French Revolution, showing the revolutionaries enthroning the goddess Reason to be worshipped in a cathedral in place of Jesus. So a bit more about those new religious movements that I mentioned. Those have proliferated since the 1960s and 1970s when the counterculture movement took off in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world. To define it briefly, the counterculture movement tended to reject all traditional sources of authority, like religion, but also political and military authorities, family, etc., etc. And they sought to produce new ideologies, new ways of being and doing to replace the ways of the old authorities and traditions. Anti-secularization theorists often argue that the existence and growth of NRMs refutes the secularization thesis, but the pro-secularization theorists would say in response that the NRMs just make up a small fraction of the population of the US and other developed countries. So they're actually not, their mere existence doesn't falsify the truth of the secularization thesis. Regardless, these various sects, cults, and NRMs are a major area of study in sociology and other scientific study of religion. One example of a guru or religious leader in the counterculture was Osho, one of the names he adopted, shown in the picture with two of his devotees in some kind of ecstasy, apparently. So more recently, what can we say about how sociology of religion has evolved, especially since the post-war, post-World War II period? So in the last 60 to 80 years, there's been an increased study of the secularization of society, interest in gathering data and analyzing data like on religious participation rates, how many people go to church, etc. There's been a huge collapse of that since the 1960s, essentially. It's one of the main findings. There's also been study of sects, cults, and NRMs. More recently, in the last few decades, there's been an increased study of mainstream Western religions, like different forms of Christianity. Previously, it was often kind of a trend or just a custom, a practice within sociology and anthropology to focus on religion in other societies, typically small scale societies like hunter-gatherers or small scale farmers, things like that, which were often thought of as exotic in some sense. But nowadays, it's just as common or more common actually to study religion in developed societies, including mainstream religions, not just NRMs or cults or sects. And also studying the religious lives of minority and immigrant communities is a big new area of research, and continued work on new religions and quasi-religions. Another thing that's worth noting in terms of the sociology of religion, but also social science study of religion generally, is that religion is often performing the social function of determining identity, group identity, in a way that's not, seems to go beyond just differences in theology and such like. So, for example, there's ethnic conflicts in the former Yugoslav republics between Serbs, Bosnians, and Croats. These people are very similar in terms of their language, much of their culture and history. And so a lot of their ethnic identity is based on their traditional religious differences. Serbs were traditionally Orthodox Christian, Bosnians were Muslim, and Croats were Catholic Christian. And what's interesting is that even modern Serbs, Bosnians, or Croats who don't believe in or practice the religion traditionally associated with their ethnic group, they still have that ethnic identity that was partially determined by the historical religious affiliation of their community. So this is just to illustrate how religious identity kind of intersects and interacts with ethnic identity oftentimes. 1.5 Anthropology of Religion. Anthropology is the scientific study of humans and human culture. The anthropology of religion treats religion as an aspect of culture. The general perspective is that religion affects the organization of society, people's understanding of their place in the world, of their relation to nature and other people, and their relation to the supernatural world. Anthropology is a positive science, not normative. So it tries to study things the way they are without including or necessitating judgments about how they should be or what people should believe and do. So, in other words, anthropology is trying to approach religion from a neutral, scientific, positive perspective. Positive in the sense of being empirical or based on sense observation and quantified data, rather than on being normative, making value judgments when they're studying cultures. Margaret Mead in the picture is a famous anthropologist of the earlier 20th century. So some of the earlier, you could call them pre-anthropological or proto-early anthropological theories of religion. These are from the 19th century and earlier in the 19th century, like mid 19th century, before anthropology was really organized as a separate discipline, as its own social science, like distinct from sociology, for example. One of the early ways that people were looking at religions, academics and scholars were looking at religion, was as something that mirrors the structure of the society in which it exists, and vice versa. But there's a kind of pattern matching between religious ideas and the structure of a society. So a couple of theorists who had this approach were Fustel de Coulanges, who was a French historian and classicist. That is, he studied ancient languages and texts. And also William Robertson Smith, who was a Scottish biblical scholar who also studied Semitic religions. Semitic peoples include Jews, Arabs, and others who speak related languages. So an example of this type of understanding of religion or interpretive approach to religion, Bedouin nomads, these are a type of Arabic nomad. They conceive of God often as a father and use familial and pastoral imagery, that is, imagery related to being a herder, having flocks of sheep and herds of cattle and so on, or horses or camels as the case may be. You can see also if you look at the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, there's a lot of similar conceptions of God, which is probably what inspired Coulanges and Smith to think along these lines in the first place. Another example is settled hierarchical societies. So settled societies are those that are non-nomadic. They're usually agricultural, and they have villages or even large towns and cities. And these, because they have greater population density in part, and because their settlements are fixed and thus easier to control and tax, They often have more elaborate hierarchical social structures of governance. And if you look at these societies, they often depict God as a monarch, as a king to whom tribute and service is due. The basic idea of this approach, it's simple enough once you get it. It's applying structures of the human society to the realm of religion. I do think this is insightful. I think this happens in a lot of cultures' religions. However, it's also worth noting that this does not exhaustively or completely explain religious ideation and ideology. It doesn't explain, for example, why people believe in gods or supernatural beings in the first place. There were also theories of the historical evolution of religion that were more prominent or popular in anthropology and the social sciences in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. According to this perspective, there's a pattern to how religion evolves historically in cultures. The oldest forms of religion are animism, which is worshiping many spirits, usually spirits of nature and ancestor spirits. Polytheism is similar, it's worshiping many gods. There's no formal or strict distinction between a spirit and a god, but gods tend to control larger spheres of nature or the cosmos. For example, there might be a god of fertility or a god of the sky, as opposed to many particular spirits of the sky or spirits who control the land in many different locations. So gods tend to have a larger sphere of control. Um, and then the third main step of religious evolution from this perspective is to monotheism. So there's this kind of historical pattern you see where the oldest human religions are animist. Around the invention of agriculture in the Neolithic era and into the Bronze and Iron Ages, you see polytheistic religions. And then starting in the early Iron Age, you see the origin of monotheistic religions like ancient Judaism or the ancient Persian religion, Zoroastrianism, for example. So some theorists associated with this evolutionary perspective were Emil Durkheim, the sociologist previously mentioned, and Edward Burnett Tylor. And these and other theorists would often point to the totemism or the animism of Australian Aboriginals as the earliest form of human religion. The reason why the Australian Aborigines or Aboriginals were often pointed to is because they were the human culture or set of cultures that most preserved ancient ways of human living that are based on hunting and foraging rather than on farming or herding. So it was presumed that their culture was probably similar to that of many prehistoric or very ancient human cultures. This view of this pattern to the evolution of religion is currently very out of fashion among anthropologists. But we have to be careful here. Just because something is not currently fashionable or it's currently looked down upon in a given field of science doesn't mean it's wrong. Fashions come and go, and there's a kind of presentist bias, a bias towards what's currently the common view in anthropology or other disciplines, where we kind of judge the rest of the history of science or of study from the standards of the present. Now, this is not always a bad thing because there is real progress in many sciences. And, the present view is probably correct in some cases. But it's really easy to be biased and to ignore, overlook, or downplay past scholarship if it doesn't fit the current paradigm. Keep in mind, fashions come and go. What's currently trendy among anthropologists is probably going to go out of fashion within the next couple of decades. So we shouldn't be overly anchored to the current perspective. Ideally, as scholars of religion, we want to try to take the perspective of previous eras of scholarship into account, as well as being open to the possibility that the current view of things is just wrong, and so we always want to be open to new evidence which might challenge it. Even though it's probably not completely 100% true that religion tends to evolve in this pattern. Historically speaking, the oldest religions are animistic. Polytheism does seem to have emerged in the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age, And monotheism, historically speaking, did seem to emerge only after polytheism had already emerged. So, in other words, there's at least some truth to the evolutionary perspective, even if it could be exaggerated or exceptions might be ignored. Um, so, you can also look at a new paradigm in social science called cultural evolution. This looks at the evolution of human cultures using mechanisms that are similar to or analogous to biological evolution, even though they're not biologically evolutionary. In biological evolution, there's natural selection, where organisms that have traits that make them more able to survive and reproduce will tend to pass on those traits to their descendants at higher rates of success, you might say. And so there's a natural selection process where the distribution of traits in a population of organisms will change over time based on that variable fitness, that variable ability of the individual organisms to survive and reproduce based on their traits. Cultural evolution is not biological evolution, but it's analogous because there can be, at least according to their hypothesis, a similar type of selection effect. Some cultures do a better job of surviving and reproducing themselves than other cultures. The reason why this is not the same as biological evolution is because cultures can spread to different people that are not genetically related. Like an example of this is the spread of the Spanish language and the Catholic Christian religion from Spain and Portugal to the New World, to the colonies of Spain and Portugal in South and Central America. So if you look at modern Mexico, they speak Spanish and most people are Roman Catholic, even though the majority of their ancestry is not Spanish. They have a lot of ancestry from the Aztecs and other native peoples. So this is just an example that illustrates how cultures can survive and reproduce independent of measures of the survival of genes in a population or of actual physical ancestry. And so these cultural evolution theorists, they try to look at patterns and structures that help explain or predict which cultures succeed and which cultures don't. And according to Ara Norenzayan and some of the other people in this social science paradigm, I think they would agree with at least certain aspects of the traditional historical evolution theory of religion. So Ara Norenzayan has a book called Big Gods, and it is a part of his thesis that there was a kind of cultural evolutionary pressure that selected for cultures that believed in gods that were powerful, that intervened a lot in human life, and that would punish or reward people based on their behavior. And so we don't see that in some ancient cultures, like many forms of animism, for example, lack gods that will punish and reward. My understanding of Australian Aboriginal religion is that there are a lot of nature spirits and ancestor spirits, but they're not always very moralizing, and they're more like archetypal patterns for living people to follow their example of, and thus participate in this kind of mystical cosmic order. I say mystical just because it transcends time in the ordinary sense. It exists both in the past, but it can also be replicated in the present. But that's different from later forms of religiosity that, historically speaking, appear to have evolved later. So anyway, Norenzayan and others have tried to argue for this perspective. They could be wrong. This is kind of an early, maybe a decade or two old innovation within social science. And so, but it just illustrates how this general idea of the historical evolution of religion from animism to polytheism to monotheism, it could have some truth to it. Anthropologists also have a lot to say about ceremony, ritual, and sacrifice, which often, arguably usually relate to religion. This goes back to the early history of the discipline. A couple of examples: the social scientists Marcel Mauss and Henri Hubert, who were both students of the sociologist Emile Durkheim, they put a lot of effort into studying ceremonial exchange, sacrifice, and magic in the various cultures that they studied. This ended up influencing the whole field of anthropology. They made the study of ceremony, ritual, and sacrifice a central part of both early sociology and anthropology. So even though anthropology of religion is just one sub-discipline within the larger field of anthropology, anthropologists early on were often interested in ceremony and ritual and sacrifice when studying culture in general. Some other anthropologists, William Robertson Smith and later Mary Douglas in the 20th century, noted something about the form of ritual, that rituals often retain their form over many generations, even as their interpretation of like the meaning of the ritual, like what is the myth being referred to or reenacted, for example, or what is the purpose of it, that can change. Oftentimes the form is conserved longer than the meaning. I think this also exists not just over time, but over space. There are examples of religions where different members of the religion will practice a similar ritual or festival, but give different interpretations of it. The example that comes to mind is in Hinduism. They have a very major festival, Holi, which is celebrated by burning bonfires and other events and practices, including spraying colors on people. And this appears to be a very ancient festival. It goes back to ancient Indian history, maybe even possibly the Bronze Age, at least the Iron Age. But point is, Vaishnava Hindus interpret this in terms of an ancient story about an incarnation of Vishnu, they're the main god that they worship, whereas other Hindus in different parts of India or just different sects can have different interpretations of the historical origin of the festival. So they all practice the festival in similar ways with colors and bonfires, but they give different interpretations to it. Magic and witchcraft partially overlaps with religion. I would say there's a fuzzy boundary between them. A simple way of marking the distinction, though, they both involve ceremony, ritual, and sacrifice. They both involve beliefs about the supernatural, like gods and spirits, for example. So in that way, you might think, oh, they must just be the same thing. But one of the main differences is that magic and witchcraft, usually the focus is not on worshiping, honoring, or sacrificing just to please gods or spirits, but rather the ceremonies, even if they include a sacrifice or an offering, they're mainly geared towards producing some objective, some result for the person who sponsors the ceremony, like casting a love spell to cause someone to fall in love with you, or performing a ritual to try to ensure that your business is successful, or in the case of what you could call sorcery, what they called in Latin maleficium, you could call it black magic, where you're trying to do a ceremony to curse or harm someone. That would be a more sort of, you could say, self-interested or self-focused objective. Whereas religion tends to be focused on away from the self, away from the ego, if you will, honoring a god or goddess or something sacred. Even if there can be a self-interested component of that, the emphasis, you would say, in religious rituals tends to be on honoring the being worshipped and sacrificing for their behalf. I think it is a spectrum. I think there's a fuzzy boundary, but that gives you an idea of the difference. So many anthropologists have focused a lot on studying magic and witchcraft. An example is Sir Edward Evans Pritchard. In 1937, he created an ethnography, so a study of a culture, of the witchcraft, oracles, and magic among the Azande people of Central Africa. He ended up concluding that beliefs that appear irrational or unscientific are, quote, perfectly logical, unquote, when seen in context. So there's different ways of interpreting this. One way, maybe like the weaker interpretation, is just that, well, if you buy into the worldview, then the magic makes sense, and so maybe we should temper our perspective on how irrational or unscientific it is. A more strong interpretation of this claim is that the magic works. Now, most anthropologists would not literally believe that magic works through supernatural agencies or otherwise, but there are some anthropologists who are open to that view, but most are kind of indulgent or sympathetic to the idea of magic because they try to identify, at least in theory or in their mindset, with the worldview of these people. But a lot of anthropologists, I have to say, are a little bit wishy-washy, or you might say relativistic, in how they describe beliefs in magic. They often don't want to appear to be contradicting the beliefs of the culture. But here is where I think it's useful to distinguish between a methodological relativism, or a weaker form of relativism, and what you could call a stronger or truth theory cultural relativism. The stronger theory says there is no objective truth and that whatever a culture believes is true for them. A lot of anthropologists adopt that perspective, but there's a huge problems with it from a philosophical point of view. Among other things, is like, if there's no objective truth, how do you even determine what a culture believes and does in the first place? And so how would you even have scientific study that has any meaning or value? You wouldn't, presumably. There's other problems too. But the weaker methodological relativism, I think, is more useful, and I think it's the real motive for why anthropologists often embrace relativism. A methodological relativism is similar to the methodological agnosticism. For the purpose of trying to understand a culture that you're studying, it can be useful to try to get in their headspace to the extent that you can, to accept their beliefs as true, their practices as legitimate, and then try to understand what follows from that, or what they believe and how it kind of holds together causally or structurally. So that's one way to approach the kind of sympathetic ear that anthropology sometimes gives to magic and witchcraft, even though it's possible or probable that a lot of it is just irrational, or you could say superstitious and what have you. Same thing could be said with religious beliefs, of course. But we don't want to beg the question here. We don't want to just assume that magic, witchcraft, or religion are irrational, unscientific. But also, we don't want to just be naive and say, oh, it makes sense to them, to the people who practice it, so it must be true. We need to be a bit more judicious than that. But I do think the methodological openness to just understand a culture's perspective before judging it is very helpful. There is an important anthropological theory called structuralism that was very influential, especially in the mid 20th century. Structuralism is the view that elements of a culture must be understood in terms of their relation to a larger system, and usually they're thinking a larger cultural system. This is influenced by the structuralist linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure. Structural linguistics holds that the meaning of speech, for example, the meaning of a word, depends on its relation to the abstract system of the language in which it's embedded, you might say, or in which it occurs. So there's this idea that you can't fully understand or define the meaning of a word or an utterance in isolation from the larger context of the language in which it occurs. This general idea of structuralism was taken over from linguistics into anthropology. The main theorist associated with this is Claude Lévi-Strauss. He analyzed the myths of different cultures, in terms of its formal structure or pattern. In his work Mythologique, which was a 4-volume study of mythology published between 1970 and 1981, he claimed to demonstrate the universality of certain themes in myths, certain recurrent themes, often expressed as binary oppositions, such as the raw versus the cooked, or culture versus nature. One thing that's interesting about Levi-Strauss's structuralist analysis of myth is that it's actually a different type of structuralism than we see in linguistics, or in how structuralism is defined generally in anthropology. He's just talking about the formal structure of myths, or recurrent patterns. I suppose you could say the meaning of one myth is thus intertwined, perhaps, with the meaning of other myths in the culture, and that would be structuralism in the normal sense. But structuralism, strictly speaking, is not just seeing a pattern or a type. It's looking at the interaction between the parts of a cultural system. So another example of structuralism in the strict sense, if you're analyzing a culture, you would interpret, for example, the meaning of one myth in part based on its relation to all the other myths in the culture, as opposed to just looking at one binary opposition like raw versus cooked food and then concluding, oh, there's a structure there, there's a pattern that might be repeated elsewhere. But anyway, structuralism was very influential in anthropology, especially through, I would say, the 1970s. One of the other limitations of structuralism, apart from the fact that the term could be used in different senses, is that if you focus too much on structural relations between cultural elements, you might lose some of their meaning. This corresponds to a basic distinction in linguistics between syntax and semantics. Syntax is the structure of speech, and you could look at this through a formal analysis similar to what you would use in mathematics or logic. And semantics has to do with the meaning, which by assumption is often not fully expressible just in terms of formal structure. And indeed, later anthropologists such as Clifford Geertz would reject structuralism because they think it neglects inner meaning. A more moderate approach is also certainly possible. It's probably true that it does help to understand the whole of a culture in order to understand the meaning of one of its parts. But it's also true that in order to get a structuralist analysis off the ground, you have to have at least some degree of understanding of the individual parts independent of the structure. So probably there's a kind of mutually reinforcing understanding that you could get where your understanding of the part increases your understanding of the whole, and your understanding of the whole or its structure increases your understanding of the isolated elements as well. Mary Douglas was the anthropologist. She did a lot of work on purity. Her book Purity and Danger from 1966 regarded the human body as a symbol system, as a microcosm or small world of society at large, which would be the macrocosm or large world. An example that she gave was Hindu Brahmins or priests who maintain their individual purity and avoid pollution, such as touching people of lower castes, in order to maintain social boundaries. So she's looking at purity in the human body as a way how it relates to human social systems and structures. Another example, Hebrew purity rules from Judaism were not based on health or hygiene, according to Douglas, but rather on a symbolic classification of animals into clean and unclean categories, depending on whether they were perceived as anomalous or not. So the animals which are cloven-hooved or whether they chew their cud. And this relates to the ritual purity status of the animal, whether they were fitting as an offering to God, and thus whether they were fitting as something that humans should consume, for example. Victor Turner was another 20th century anthropologist who emphasized the reality of ritual, in the sense that ritual performs a real function, has a real meaning for society. I mean, there's a tendency of the social scientists of the 19th century, because of their own scientific worldview, to be somewhat dismissive or even pejorative towards pre-modern cultures, which they often studied, who had a non-scientific or pre-scientific worldview. And so you see this general trend, we've seen some examples of it already in the 20th century in anthropology, to try to rehabilitate the notion of ritual, of religion, even of magic or witchcraft, to try to lend a more sympathetic or at least understanding perspective on some of these other cultures. Turner did detailed studies of rituals and symbols. He did fieldwork among the Ndembu people of Zambia in the 1950s. He noted that ritual has a procedural nature, but also theatrical and dramatic aspects. So you're kind of highlighting there the social and psychological element of ritual for how it achieves its purpose. Turner started out as a religious skeptic, but after studying the Ndembu, concluded that religion corresponds to a real and distinctive dimension of their lives, and he later converted to Catholic Christianity. Clifford Geertz was another 20th century anthropologist who basically rejected structuralism, and he looked more at culture and, moreover, how meaning is expressed in culture than just at social structure. He said that religion gives meaning to human societies and that religious symbols codify an ethos, a kind of worldview. They both reflect and shape society. In other words, he was rejecting a purely structuralist analysis. A very important and famous distinction in anthropology is that between emic and etic perspectives. This was developed by Kenneth Pike, a 20th century social scientist. Emic basically means internal, so it's attempting to explain things within the cultural world of the believer. It's trying to take the perspective of members of the culture when studying their religion, for example. Etic just means external, so it's attempting to explain behaviors and beliefs of a society from a scientific perspective, usually. So in terms of how scholars themselves relate to this emic-etic distinction, there's a sense in which the scholar's perspective is inherently etic. In anthropology, it's a social science. They're studying cultures from a scientific perspective. So it's going to be that of an external observer to the culture. But the scholar also makes use or can make use of emic perspectives as well to try to understand the culture from within, you might say. A kind of subtle but important point is that both of these emic and etic perspectives are those taken by a scholar. So if a scholar is trying to take an emic perspective, it still might be biased, filtered, or incomplete because it's still their perspective at the end of the day. A point of contrast between anthropology or other social scientific study of religion and theology is that theology is generally an emic perspective, that taken by a member of the religion itself, and that's one of the ways we can helpfully distinguish theological and social scientific perspectives on the study of religion. There's another distinction which is very similar to the emic-etic distinction, but not quite identical to it. That's the distinction between insider and outsider perspectives on a culture or a religion. The insider perspective is the perspective and the theories and the concepts of a believer. So, for example, the testimony of a religious believer. The outsider perspective is that of a scholar or other non-believer. So when we're talking about religion specifically. What's the difference between this insider-outsider distinction and the emic-etic distinction? They sound pretty similar. Well, the insider is, by definition, not actually a scholar. So that's basically the only difference. Emic, technically, is still the perspective taken by a scholar insofar as they're trying to approximate a true insider perspective. But the insider perspective would be testimony or, just a speech given by an actual member of the culture, an actual member of the religion, as without any filter, you might say, of a scholar or just an outsider. Now, in practice, the emic-etic and insider-outsider perspectives are often blurred. For example, scholars who do field work, they might live in the village of the people they're studying, for example. They might become part of the group that they study, so then that would kind of blur some of those distinctions, or at least complicate them. What about scholars who are both insiders and outsiders? This is a thing, it does happen. Scholars, for example, may also be religious believers. In this way, they can potentially inhabit both insider and outsider perspectives, specifically if they do scholarship on the religion that they're also a believer in. An example of this is Gavin Flood, a Hindu who is also a scholar of Hindu Shaivism, or Hindus who worship Shiva as the supreme being. And there's also a kind of larger interaction between these different perspectives of insider, outsider, and emic-etic at the social level. For example, religious groups could potentially be influenced by what scholars say about them. Now let's look at some recent trends in the anthropology of religion. There are some philosophical theories that have been very influential ironically, mainly outside of philosophy in the social sciences and the broader academia, and now the culture generally. Critical theory, postmodernism, and post-colonial theory. I'll talk a bit more about these in the philosophy of religion section, but basically critical theory analyzes social and cultural phenomena in terms of relations of oppressed and oppressor, classes, races, different sexual orientations or identities, etc. So they're doing a kind of power analysis and trying to explain everything, or at least most things in terms of that analysis. Postmodernism takes a critical stance towards grand narratives. They often question objective reality. They're often relativists about truth. That means each culture or each individual has its own truth, and there is no truth for everyone. They adopt what is called a hermeneutic, or an interpretive framework of suspicion. They don't just take scholarship, for example, as being objective. They emphasize the power relations as explanations for narratives as well. And there you can see the kind of overlap between critical theory and postmodernism. And post-colonial theory is the critical study of the legacy of colonialism and imperialism in various cultures that were colonized. Mainly they're looking at cultures colonized by European countries rather than other types of colonizers. There's also been some common themes in anthropology. This is, at least since the 1960s. Globalization, the increasing interconnection of the world due to trade and communication technology, like the internet. Multiculturalism. Typically, this is not just a theoretical framework, but advocating coexistence of diverse cultural or ethnic groups in the same society. So all of these ideas have been very influential in anthropology. And for better or worse, they influence the perspective that a lot of anthropologists take when they study cultures. Also, anthropology of religion is no longer so focused on exotic, small-scale societies, like hunter-foragers in Africa or Australia, for example. Some examples of the new lines of research are studies on Pentecostalism in the US and other countries, and new religious movements in modern societies. Pentecostals, by the way, are Christians who emphasize experiencing the Holy Spirit while they worship, such as having the gift of speaking in tongues, for example. 1.6 Psychology of Religion. William James was the first American psychologist and philosopher, in the sense that he was the first who researched and taught those subjects in the academy. I believe he was at Harvard University. So philosophically, he's associated with pragmatism, which there's different types and aspects of pragmatism, but one of the main ideas is pragmatism as a theory of truth, that what is true, like a true proposition, a true claim, is what it is useful to believe. And you can see some of James' views about pragmatism in his book, The Will to Believe. But he was also a psychologist. By the way, back then in the late 1800s, psychology was not always that distinct from philosophy, and it was one of the last of the sciences to kind of splinter off from philosophy. And so that was really happening in the lifetime and career of William James. By the time he had died, psychology was more or less a distinct discipline, but that had not been the case previously in the mid to late 19th century. So he also was a psychologist, and he wrote a very important work on the psychology of religion called The Varieties of Religious Experience. This is one of the first psychological studies of religion. James focused on mystical experiences and conversion experiences. He also put a lot of focus on a spiritual movement in his own time called the New Thought movement. And this was that movement that I mentioned previously that believed in mind over matter, in the sense that mind or thought can influence or control reality. So if you want, for example, to improve your life, you should improve your thinking first. The thought is upstream from other aspects of reality. And he did a lot of analysis of just what the ideology of this new movement was, how it resembled and differed from other previous religious movements, and so on. So this text, even though it's quite old, is still influential, I think it's fair to say, on the psychology of religion and of mysticism. And mysticism can be defined briefly as practices or beliefs related to self-transcendence. For example, of trying to pray to experience a union of the soul with God. And there's different types of mysticism in different cultures. Um, any state of consciousness that is radically different from ordinary waking consciousness in respect of weakening the boundary between self and world, or self and other, or self and God, or self and spirit. This could be counted as mystical. Another example of a mystical experience or practice would be a spirit medium, where you channel the spirit of a god, or some being like that, and it speaks through you. Sigmund Freud was a famous early psychologist. He was one of the founders of the discipline. As previously mentioned, he did have theories about religion. In terms of his general psychology, he emphasized the role of sexual drives in psychological development. And his theory of the subconscious, that is, there's a lot of thought or cognitive processing or even emotions that happen below the threshold of consciousness, is often regarded as a major contribution to psychology. Having said that, his specific theories are generally disputed nowadays. They are pseudoscientific in the sense that he didn't follow scientific method to develop them. Now, it doesn't mean everything he said is false just because it's not scientific. You can gain knowledge about the world just through careful observation, even if you're not doing controlled experiments or collecting numerical data and analyzing it and developing mathematical models, stuff like that. But on the other hand, because his work is largely kind of speculative, and usually when people would try to bring up counterexamples to his theories, he or his followers would just try to explain them away. They're often regarded as somewhat problematic for that reason, and not just as not being scientific. In terms of his views of religion, Freud viewed religion as a psychological coping mechanism. So we depend on our parents when we're young for a sense of safety and security, for actual material resources as well. And when you develop, you lose that sense of the parent. Maybe they die, maybe you just don't live with them or can't depend on them as much. And so, according to Freud, the human mind creates God or Heavenly Father as an idealized substitute parent that you can petition to protect and help you because you don't have the same access to a real parent. And so it helps people cope with their anxiety or things like that. Freud also thought that religion helps people vent antisocial anxieties in a way that's not threatening to their place within the group. So you could act out maybe certain resentments in a religious context that you couldn't actually show openly against your actual social rivals or what have you. So there's probably some truth to this perspective. There's actually modern psychological research on religion and its role in psychological healing. You could look at that negatively as coping, or maybe you could look at it positively as healing or protective against mental illness or something like that. But there's probably a limitation to how much of religion Freud's views explain. Not all religion consists of believing in a heavenly father or even like a divine mother. That's part of religious beliefs, but there's a lot of other stuff too. So that's just an example of how Freud's theory is probably at least incomplete at best. Carl Jung was a friend and protege of Freud. Freud was his early professional mentor. A couple of the works of Jung that are more widely known, he wrote a lot of more technical, theoretical, and hard to understand works, like Ion, for example, but he has a couple of works that are pretty accessible and therefore more widely read. One of them is his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, where he does go over some of the basic ideas of his theory. And another is the book Man and His Symbols, which is a popular summary of Jung's thought. Like Freud, Jung's theories are not scientific, and they're more, I would say, accepted or popular outside of the science of psychology than inside. But one of the interesting things about Jung is that he was more open to and sympathetic to religion than Freud. So he has a bunch of key concepts, and many of them relate to religious ideation. So he had this notion of the archetype, which is a recurrent pattern in human thought, belief, or ideation that recurs independently in different human cultures. And so one person in one culture or one era may independently discover, if you will, an archetype. And it's because, according to Jung, these are kind of embedded in the human unconscious, and that's why they can reveal themselves in different cultures. So he believed in the unconscious. He used that word instead of Freud's subconscious, because subconscious implies below conscious, below the threshold of consciousness. And Jung thought that Freud was kind of overly negative about the subconscious. Like the subconscious is usually full of inappropriate or excessive sexual drives or other materialistic drives that need to be kind of repressed or channeled in order for society to function. But Jung was more kind of optimistic about what he called the unconscious as a potential source of wisdom. So it's almost true to say, I think, that for Jung, the unconscious in his theory plays a role similar to the general idea of the spiritual realm, or the supernatural realm in religion. The supernatural or the spiritual could be harmful, it can be helpful, but it has this kind of charged, otherworldly aspect to it that kind of doesn't fit into our ordinary waking consciousness framework or paradigm. So I think there's some truth to that analogy. Jung believed in the collective unconscious as well, which is somehow something that all humans share, even though we have our own subjective awareness and point of view and standpoint, and our minds are separate. He thought somehow we're connected, maybe just through shared human nature. I'm not sure he had a complete theory about that, but that's also why archetypes can show up in the minds of different people that are not, like spatially or causally connected, but they can show up at the same time. He also believed in synchronicity, or a meaningful coincidence. He called it an acausal connecting principle. So events can happen at the same time that have a symbolic and meaningful connection to each other, even though there's no known natural causal link. And this might be somewhat ambiguous as to whether Jung thought there was an actual supernatural causal connection between these two events. Like, for example, I know some Catholics are claiming that there was recently, I think in Argentina, a Catholic cathedral that's also a pilgrimage center. There was an alleged apparition of the Virgin Mary there, where there was a statue of Saint Peter, with the keys of Saint Peter, that was hit by a bolt of lightning. And some Catholics are saying, based on the timing of when it hit, they think it was a divine signal that was meaning to show divine displeasure at a pronouncement or maybe some document promulgated, I can't remember exactly, by Pope Francis, the current pope, because St. Peter is regarded as the founder of the Catholic Church. The current pope or head of the church is regarded as the successor to St. Peter. So this would be an example of an event that Jung would probably agree. There's a synchronicity there. There's at least a symbolic connection between the two things, in this case in the minds of some Catholic believers. But there's a larger question here. First of all, is it good to take the meaning from this apparent coincidence, or is that going to be just superstitious and irrational? Jung tended to be more open and optimistic about taking these coincidences as meaningful and trying to learn from them. And then another question is whether there's an actual supernatural causal connection. Now, Jung defined a synchronicity as acausal, but the question is whether he's just trying to rule out natural causation. I think he was very ambivalent himself about the supernatural, whether it existed, if so, what is its nature, and so on. So he kind of left that open. Jung, one of his most famous ideas is the shadow, which is a kind of dark, destructive, potentially, aspect of the unconscious. And it represents the psychological content that a person represses so that it doesn't enter into consciousness. Jung's view is that this repression of the shadow is destructive and it can lead to internal and external conflict. And so he thought you have to somehow kind of like liberate the shadow. It doesn't mean just giving into it totally through like some kind of indulgence, like for example, a repressed sexual drive or something like that. But you have to form some more healthy, open relationship to it. That's kind of his general framework for therapy and just like human psychological health in general. Um, and then he had a theory of the self, capital S, which is a symbol or maybe like a term for psychic wholeness. So the self is kind of like the idealized, actualized, developed, mature person or personality. But Jung thought that you could get sort of images or symbols of the self, like the mandala in Tibetan Buddhism, that could emerge from the unconscious as a kind of archetype. And then the anima is another concept he's famous for, which is the feminine psychological principle. So he thought that men have a feminine side of their nature that must be integrated with their conscious male persona in order for there to be psychic wholeness. And he thought, conversely, there was a corresponding animus or male spirit for women. So this is just a brief introduction to Jung's psychology. It's been very influential, I would say, on the larger popular culture. People interested in spirituality or psychology, a lot of New Age people. Less influential nowadays within the science of psychology. It's considered pseudoscientific. But his view of religion is more positive or optimistic than that of Freud. Jung thought that religion includes symbols that illuminate the unconscious layers of the mind, like dreams. And so it can be worthwhile to study religion and take it seriously and to try to learn from it, learn some kind of wisdom. So that's it for our summary of the psychology of religion. We've kind of skipped over, for reasons of time, it's already going a bit long here. We skipped over a lot of the more recent psychology of religion that tends to be more quantitative, more scientific. Just to let you know that there is such research out there and it's potentially very interesting. But for reasons of time, we have to move on. So section 1.7, myth, symbol, the sacred, and ritual. Myth is one of the main elements of religion and culture that's studied by anthropology and sociology. Myths convey meanings in stories. They highlight and dramatize key issues and values in the life of individuals and society. And they often do so indirectly, because meanings can be unspoken or unspeakable or hard to convey through words, and they can relate to intuition, feeling, emotion, and relationships. Like, you can't fully describe verbally the meaning of a very moving piece of music. Part of the meaning is the experience of it emotionally and otherwise. So some examples of myths are those that deal with themes of life and death, the origin of humanity, the meaning of a human life, the duties of a citizen or of a spouse or of a creature of God, etc. You can look at myth as a bridge between the intellect and emotion. Myths express ideas, including ones that can be understood intellectually, but they also trigger a emotional response. Myths are unlike scientific theories. Scientific theories focus on testable predictions. Myths focus on meaning, and they try to orient people towards acting and living and being a certain way in the world. But myths can also claim to explain natural or social phenomena, and that way they can overlap with and be contradicted by scientific theories. There are often recurrent patterns in myth. For example, linear versus cyclical views of time. Is the cosmos linear? Does it have a fixed beginning and end? Or is it cyclical? Does it recur in similar ways throughout time? Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism have cyclical views of cosmic time, whereas the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and also the religion Zoroastrianism, has a more linear view of history as a whole, it's fair to say. Other examples of patterns are historical versus phenomenological. Historical myths emphasize events that happened in human history or in the history of the cosmos. Phenomenological myths would highlight aspects of stories that relate to human experience of the world. Phenomenology is the study of the phenomena or the appearances, the way things, the world and self appear to humans in their consciousness, and so on. The picture in the slide is from a Sumerian and later Babylonian myth of Gilgamesh, an ancient Sumerian king, and his companion in arms, Enkidu, when they're slaying this spiritual being, the bull of heaven. Later, that leads to a curse that results in the death of Enkidu. A symbol is something that communicates meaning. It, like myths, will unite the intellect and the emotions. There's usually both intellectual and emotional aspects to symbolic meaning. And symbols can integrate personal and social dimensions of religion. We can distinguish between symbols and signs. Signs, such as words, tend to be more arbitrary. That is, the form of the sign doesn't necessarily evoke or correspond to its meaning. It can be just a matter of convention. So, for example, there's nothing about the word dog that suggests the type of creature that it means or refers to. Symbols tend to be more intimately involved in that to which they refer. You can say a symbol participates in what it symbolizes. So an example of this could be a kiss, which is a customary way of expressing intimacy with the person, but it does involve actual physical contact as well. Religious symbols often express sacred values. For example, the cross of Jesus Christ, the bull of Shiva, and the Bodhi tree, the tree of enlightenment in Buddhism. Sacred symbols are identified with by the faithful, and they may take offense if the symbol is attacked. So because the symbol is referring to the sacred value must be protected. That's why people can take such offense when the sacred symbols of their religion are attacked or defiled or criticized and so on. Symbols, one of the things they do is they can provide a focal point of faith and action. An example of this is the Eucharist, where the bread and wine, at least symbolically, maybe really, are signs or indicators of the real presence of God among the community of believers. Symbols can unite believers into a community. So a lot of rituals involve people walking together around or bowing together around a sacred symbol. The picture on the slide is from the story of Adam and Eve from the Hebrew Bible. So this is by Michelangelo. It's in the Sistine Chapel, and it's showing the temptation and fall of humanity. And the fact that the serpent is the tempter, it seems symbolic, right? Serpents are often poisonous. They can be harmful to humans. The tree of knowledge itself involves a symbol. The fruit is a symbol. It's sweet tasting, but it's supposed to be connected to knowledge and sin. So yeah, there's all these layers and layers of symbolism in that particular myth or story. Another important concept in the study of religion is the sacred. The sacred is value or meaning that transcends that of the ordinary world. So an example of something not sacred or profane might be an everyday transaction, like going to Starbucks and buying a coffee. Unless you're really, really into coffee and you worship it as a god, it's probably not going to be a sacred event for you, right? Whereas something like experiencing God or something else that you worship or hold as being transcendently valuable, that would be something sacred. Mircea Eliade is one of the most famous scholars of the sacred. He wrote a book on the sacred and the profane, and he claimed that understanding myths involves a sense of the sacred. And he said that secularized Westerners, and nowadays we might add people from other countries that are modern and developed and tend to be irreligious, like in China, for example, or Japan, they've lost the sense of the sacred and try to compensate by other means like science fiction, fantasy, supernatural literature, and film. So he's kind of positing that there's a kind of human need for the sacred, and it can involve myths and stories of the supernatural. And so that's something that we maybe need to have in our lives. He's basically saying that even from a scientific perspective, there's an inherent value to a lot of religion. By the way, when we use this term myth, it's not implying that the stories are false. There's another sense of the word myth that would imply that, like it's only a myth. There's a technical meaning of the word myth that's used by social scientists. It's not presumed that a myth is false, but what's being presumed or claimed there is that the main purpose of the story is not just the literal facts being conveyed, but something about their meaning or how they help orient people to the cosmos and to their purpose. And that's also related to Eliada's view of myths, that they can point people towards the sacred. Ritual is any patterned, formal, symbolic action. An example of a non-religious ritual is a national anthem, which is a conventional way for a person to honor their nation or their homeland. A religious ritual specifically will reference sacred or supernatural beings whom the participants in the ritual invoke, that is, they call upon them, propitiate, that is, they give offerings to them of some kind or another, or feed through offering or sacrifice, or otherwise communicate with them. An example of a religious ritual is the Christian Mass or Eucharist, where Christians experience communion with Jesus through eating bread and drinking wine. Religious rituals often attempt to enact and deal with central dilemmas of human existence, like continuity and stability, growth and fertility, mortality, immortality, transcendence. Rituals can transform people and situations. So, for example, a marriage ceremony will transform the social status of the participants. A coming of age ceremony might turn a boy into a fierce warrior, and so on. Rituals, because they involve physical actions, can have mind and body effects. The physical actions of the ritual can have psychological effects. This is a supra-rational process often. The effects of the ritual can exceed the conscious understanding of the rational mind. And one way this is done is through extreme circumstances. Now, not all rituals are extreme, but especially ones that involve a change in status or a life cycle ritual, like being initiated into adulthood, they can be performed in terrifying circumstances, especially in coming of age rituals for boys, where a lot of traditional societies try to convert boys into adulthood by making them into warriors, as previously referenced. Another example of a coming of age ceremony is the Upanayana, the Vedic or Hindu initiation ceremony, where a boy basically comes of age as someone who's ready to study the Veda and potentially lead a household, lead a family in a Vedic ritual life. The Veda is the scriptures of Hinduism. Rituals often use symbols and sacred objects. So these can convey messages about an individual, society, or the cosmos through manipulation of those symbols and sacred objects. Rituals can also be used to control, inspire, subvert, stabilize, and so on individuals and groups. So they often are performing a social function. Catherine Bell had a useful typology or classification scheme of different religious rituals, and this gives you a sense of the main types of religious rituals that you find. Number one, rites of passage or life crisis rituals. These mark entry into a new social role or a new phase of life, like baptism in Christianity, which is your initiation into the Christian community, confirmation in some sects of Christianity, where you basically confirm your baptismal vows. It's like an adult religious initiation ceremony, especially for those Christians who practice infant baptism. Second type of ritual, calendrical and commemorative rites. These are ones that happen at particular times in the calendar year, hence the word calendrical. An example is the Feast of the Assumption in Christianity, or Catholic Christianity, which celebrates the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary into heaven. A third type of ritual is rites of exchange or communication. So these are not marking off a life crisis or an entry into a new stage of life necessarily, and they don't always have to happen at the same time of year. So you'll notice that types 1 and types 2 are more connected to specific times. Type 1, a specific time in a person's life. Type 2, a specific time in the year. Type 3 can happen intermittently or as needed. So for example, the Christian Eucharist or rite of communion, where a person eats the bread and drinks the wine, that is either the real presence or at least symbolic of, depending on the Christian interpretation, of Jesus, his body and blood. Excuse me. Type 4 ritual is a rite of affliction. This is done to the sick or to the dying, and it could include exorcism, so someone who's plagued by a demon or an evil spirit. Another example is the anointing of the sick, or it used to be called extreme unction in the Catholic Church. If a person is sick or dying, they can be anointed with olive oil as part of a ritual, a sacrament. And the idea is it will maybe heal them, at least spiritually. And you get these in most religions, most cultures actually. Type 5 is a rite of feasting, fasting, or festivals. These will also happen at certain times of the year, like type 2, but they are usually communal or collective celebrations. And it can be either feasting, that is eating a lot, or fasting. Like the Christian festival season of Lent involves fasting, whereas Easter and Christmas involve feasts. That's where the word festival comes from feast. And then type 6 is a political ritual. This is conferring legitimacy or a kind of sacred or spiritual status upon a king or other ruler. So an example would be a coronation, usually where a priest would crown, at least symbolically, a monarch or other head of state. Scholars' views of ritual often vary. Durkheim and many later scholars actually posited that rituals are socially effective because they make statements about social phenomena. So there's no claim being made here to a real supernatural world or some kind of real supernatural effect of the ritual, or at least non-scientifically known effect. But they're interpreting the ritual mainly in terms of its effects on society. And so Durkheim seems to believe that even if God or spirits or gods invoked in rituals don't exist, they're not real, so in a sense the whole thing is fake or based on misperception, the ritual might still be necessary because of how it affects the society. It performs a social function. Mircea Eliade focused on the explanatory value of rituals, their connection to myths, rituals as reenactments of primal cosmogonic, that means connected to the genesis, the origin of the cosmos, the world, bringing the past continually into the present. And Robin Horton emphasized the reality of the religious beliefs behind ritual actions. So, for example, the Kalabari people of Nigeria, religious rituals have power to move and transform their participants because they express beliefs that have meaning and coherence to their adherents. So Horton is not necessarily claiming here that the beliefs connected to the rituals are true, that the gods or spirits or whatever actually exist and perform certain actions in response to the human ritual, but rather that people have to believe that the rituals are real, or that those beliefs that they are real are part of how the rituals function, how they produce effects in their participants. And Maurice Bloch argued that rituals are not solely statements, nor are they solely actions. Their message can be simultaneously communicated and disguised. So it's highlighting these two aspects of ritual. They can involve statements, as it were, about God or the gods or about society or social roles, but they also have this active component to them. So they kind of combine both. This is similar to the idea in philosophy of language and linguistics of a performative utterance, a speech act that when you perform it, it actually changes something, whether physically or socially. Like when you utter "I do" in a marital ceremony, that can actually, just saying the words can change the social reality there. And the second point, their message can be simultaneously communicated and disguised. This is a reference to the symbolic aspect of a lot of religious rituals. Some of the meaning of the ritual will be conveyed literally, some of it will be conveyed symbolically and thus indirectly, which you could look at as a type of disguise, at least in a sense. Rituals often have patterns. Some of the examples of those patterns can be found in initiation rituals. An early social scientist to look at this was Arnold von Gennep. He discovered a threefold pattern in many rituals. 1. Separation. 2. Transition. 3. Reintegration. You can see these, for example, in seasonal festivals and life crisis rituals. In initiation ceremonies, the young man or woman is often separated from society. So, for example, in many North American Indian cultures, young people would have to go fast. They would separate from their tribe or community, go into the wilderness, and fast for many days until they received a vision. And after that vision, which would be like the transition period, they would reintegrate with their society with this new status of being an adult. Seasonal festivals can also involve this pattern. You can look at the Lenten season in Christianity as a type of separation. So the Lent is the period of fasting that happens before Easter. And it's a kind of mournful period. It's a period of trying to take a step back from worldly concerns, sacrifice, give up things, and then there's an eventual transition and reintegration. And the reintegration fully happens with the festival of Easter, which ends the Lenten season and celebrates the resurrection of Jesus. Rituals generally involve both physical movement and social movement or change as well. Like in the example of the American Indian fasting that's done with the coming of age ritual, there's a physical movement away from the tribe. And then once the vision happens and the person returns, there's a social movement as well. They've been confirmed as an adult member of the tribe. Victor Turner did a lot of work on rites of passage. So they include initiation ceremonies where you're being initiated into adulthood. It's a passage from one social state or one state of being to another. He talked about the liminal stage. Liminal means at the border or boundary or threshold. The liminal stage involves movement from the social structure to an anti-structural position. And this, he says, happens in the liminal or middle stage of rites of passage. Those undergoing the initiation into the new social status, the initiands, often face a leveling process. They may be stripped of their garments. They can have their individuality erased, such as having their hair shaved or grown long. Either way, they lose their usual social presentation. Neophytes, those who have not yet been initiated, are isolated from the everyday world. They may undergo ordeals that bind them together. There's also a sense of communitas, or community in Latin, spontaneous, immediate, concrete relatedness that's typical of people in liminal stage of a rite of passage. So partly just psychologically speaking, when people are taken out of their ordinary state of being, it can create a bonding if they're all being put through the same trial. Liminality can also be institutionalized and extended indefinitely, as in the military. So this type of analysis is often applied to basic training for army recruits, for example. Monastic communities, there's periods of initiation for monks, hospitals, asylums, and so on. So there also is often a transmission of esoteric or hidden knowledge that occurred during this process of initiation. Examples include the ancient Greek mystery religions, which they had vows of silence. People who received the secret knowledge were not supposed to repeat it, so we don't know that much about what the alleged secret knowledge was. Another example that's been proposed based on archaeological findings is a Proto-Indo-European. This is a name that linguists give to an ancient people who, archaeologically speaking, are probably the Yamnaya, but they spoke a language that was the ancestor of a bunch of other related languages that are classified as Indo-European. They include languages as diverse as English, German, French, Italian, Farsi, and Hindi. But they practiced a dog sacrifice for their male initiands, and this was something that would have been way outside the norm, in which dogs were trusted companions in hunting and probably also to help guard an encampment of these nomadic people. And so they were your friends, they were your companions. Being asked to sacrifice one as part of some ceremony would have been very shocking, would have taken these young men outside of their ordinary social environment. Bruce Lincoln has done work on female initiation rituals. He criticized von Gennep's and Turner's models as only relevant to male initiations. He also finds a threefold pattern in many societies' female initiations, but it's a different one: enclosure, metamorphosis or magnification, and emergence. He says that women tend to have less status in most social hierarchies, and the liminal stage in women's initiations is less likely to emphasize anti-structural elements, so going against the grain of the norms or practices of the society, as in the dog sacrifice of the ancient Proto-Indo-Europeans. Women's rituals also don't involve being brought low as a prelude to being elevated, not being stripped, for example, of your identity. Instead, they reinforce a woman's place in society, which he characterizes as lowly in a lot of traditional societies. Women's initiations are also more likely to be single, not with a group, and enclosed within a domestic space. Women are often adorned during their initiation ceremonies rather than stripped. And he claims that it's more common for mundane, i.e., everyday or worldly knowledge rather than esoteric, to be transmitted to women in their initiation ceremonies. And then another example of a scholar who's done work on ritual that is appreciated by a lot of social scientists is Richard Schechner. As far as I know, he's a professor of theater, so he's not a social scientist, but he's done research on rituals versus performances and how they resemble and differ from each other. That's been informative to social scientists who study ritual. Rituals are a type of performance, but according to Schechner, not all performances are rituals. So performance would be the genus or broader category, rituals would be the species or narrow category, subcategory. Whether a performance counts as a ritual or as theater depends on the context. Ritual would be another subcategory of performance that is different from ritual. It's for entertainment, for example, rather than to change social relations or relations with gods. These are not absolute distinctions, though. According to Schechner, most performances contain elements of both. So rituals are intended to be efficacious. They tend to have active audiences who share in the aims and intentions of the main actors and maybe in the performance of the ritual itself. The time and the space of a ritual is sacred and they are symbolically marked. And the end result of the ritual is what matters. Does the healing take place? Is the initiation completed successfully? Are the dead actually helped by the ritual, etc.? And the rituals are performed for or in the presence of a higher power or an absent other, usually a god or a spirit. Theatrical performances, on the other hand, are mainly intended to entertain, and the audience is more passive. They observe rather than participate in the action for the most part. The event also tends to be an end in itself. It's not done primarily for the sake of some other objective or result. Rather, it's performed for those attending, not for a higher power or an absent other, like a god or a spirit. 1.8 Philosophy and Religious Studies. Philosophy can be defined as a field that attempts to use reason to understand and explain the world. And that you can kind of contrast it with religion, which often uses myths or tradition or revelation to explain and describe things. More narrowly, you can define philosophy as the rational inquiry of subjects that cannot be answered purely through mathematics or through empirical science, to answer questions such as what is knowledge, what is the fundamental nature of reality, what is a good human life, and so on. Philosophy is a much older field than religious studies, but the philosophical contribution to religious studies can include the analysis and argument for or critique of religious beliefs, and so on. Ancient Greek philosophy began around the late 7th or early 6th century BC with a figure known as Thales. Thales was from the Greek city of Miletus, and he's known for giving a materialistic theory of the first principle of nature. So Thales thought that everything in nature comes from water. He thought that water was the arche, or the first principle. Now, many of these naturalistic and other philosophical theories developed by ancient Greek philosophers were aimed at replacing religious myths to explain the cosmos. But there's a long kind of tradition as well of philosophical theology, where philosophers would try to articulate and defend theories about God, the soul, and the afterlife, just to name some examples. And that would relate not only to theology with theories of God, but also metaphysics or theories of being, when you have philosophical theories about the soul and the afterlife and just other kinds of existence. And there's basically overlap between some of these philosophical theories and religious beliefs. They kind of intersected and also influenced each other. So some of the Greek philosophical theology went on to influence later theologians who were Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, for example. So Parmenides was a philosopher who lived in the late 6th and early 5th century BC. And he argued that all of reality is one unchanging, imperceptible being. He had rational arguments for this to try to prove that change is logically impossible. It leads to contradictions. He's actually one of the first, maybe the first, Greek philosopher to actually give logical arguments to try to prove his claims. Now, not many people, he had some followers, like the philosopher Zeno, who created Zeno's paradoxes to try to support Parmenides' view. Not many philosophers, though, followed his theory, but many were interested in trying to critique it or explain why it was wrong, why there are multiple beings, or why change and things like motion through space, for example, are actually possible. Parmenides' main idea was that not being can't exist because it cannot be thought of, because only being can be thought of, not the negation. So he was trying to show what can be thought of, what is logically conceivable. But he thought that proceeding in that fashion, you could rule out the existence of multiple beings or of change of being. But this idea of an eternally unchanging, imperceptible being influenced many later theological and philosophical views of God, even among those who otherwise disagreed with Parmenides' metaphysics. Pythagoras was a famous early Greek philosopher who lived from 570 to 495 BC. He's famous for arguing that the soul is immortal and that it reincarnates in different bodies, both human and animal. He also thought that the arche, or the first principle of being and change or coming to be, is numbers. So he thought there was a kind of numerical, maybe you could say mathematical or geometrical structure to the cosmos. He's famous for the Pythagorean theorem. Historically speaking, that was probably developed by later followers of his. But the point is that the followers of Pythagoras were very interested in mathematics because they thought there was a mathematical order to the cosmos. And he thought that the universe is governed by a kind of divine harmony. So Pythagoras and his followers, the Pythagoreans, were interested in musical analogies or aspects of the cosmos. One of the things that they discovered was that the length of a vibrating string would correlate with its pitch. So in other words, there are these correlations between different aspects of reality that can be expressed numerically. Plato was a famous philosopher, the most famous follower of Socrates. Socrates was one of the first Greek philosophers to systematically look at theories of the good and of justice, philosophy of the human and social kind, as he put it. So Plato, one of his main followers, in addition to being influenced by Socrates, was also influenced by Pythagoras. So Plato lived from 428 to 348 BC, and he tried to argue for the immortality of the soul using rational arguments, and he believed in reincarnation. But he had other ideas apart from Pythagoras. Plato thought that numbers were important in nature of reality, but in addition to numbers, or you could say mathematical ideas, Plato believed in the forms or the ideas as these eternal principles that include many concepts, including beauty and justice. So it's not only mathematics at the heart of reality, but many ideas or forms. And they were called forms because they had a kind of form or logical structure to them. And these things are non-material, they're eternal. And Plato was a big critic of ancient Greek religion and mythology. So he criticized, for example, the poet Homer, who gave many stories of the gods and heroes like Odysseus and Achilles in the Trojan War, because Plato thought that Homer's gods and heroes, and that of a lot of other ancient Greek stories from other poets and just from tradition, portrayed the gods as sometimes acting immorally or irrationally. And Plato was a big believer that no, whatever is divine must be rational and moral all the time. So Plato thought that the ultimate principle of all being and coming to be or becoming was one thing. He called it the good or the one, and he symbolized it in some of his philosophical stories by the sun. So the sun, just as it gives light to the world, Plato argued that the good gives being or reality to all the other forms or ideas, and they in turn give being or reality to all of the material objects that are particular and can be destroyed. They can come into being and go out of being, unlike the forms themselves. So there's a lot of like complex metaphysical ideas here, and also ideas relating to epistemology or theory of knowledge. But again, Plato's philosophical theory of the good influenced many later theologies. So one of the things we can say from a religious studies perspective is that in some religious traditions, they would get ideas from philosophy, Greek philosophy in the West and Near East, and there were other philosophical traditions too, like in India and China and other civilizations as well. So there's kind of like an interplay between certain religious beliefs and philosophy over the centuries. Plato's student was Aristotle, or his most famous student, who lived from 384 to 322 BC. And Aristotle had a lot in common with Plato, but he thought of human souls as being part of a matter-form composite, you might say. So, whereas Plato believed that souls and other non-material principles can exist wholly outside of matter, Aristotle, he did believe in forms that give a logical structure to reality, but that they always go together with matter, including in the case of humans and other living organisms. For Aristotle, it's not just humans that have souls, but the soul is like a life principle that any living thing would have. So he also had his own kind of philosophical theology, you might say. He also believed in a first cause or first principle of other beings, and he called it the unmoved mover because it causes motion or change in other beings but is itself unmoved. And again, Aristotle's ideas of the unmoved mover had an influence on some later theologians, like from Islam and Christianity, for example. Stoicism is a school of ancient Greek philosophy. They had their own kind of philosophical theology related to their metaphysics or theory of being. So they believed that the material cosmos, the universe, was governed through rational principles, what we might call today natural laws, and that they thought there was a logos or a rational pattern or structure that governs the cosmos. They connected it to fire or energy, as we might say today. And there are a lot of things about this that were influential on later philosophers and theologians. In late antiquity, so this would be like the later Roman Empire, like the 3rd century AD and on, there was a kind of influential mix of Plato, Aristotle, Stoicism, and Pythagoreanism that you would call Neoplatonism, which was based on originally the writings of Plotinus, a later follower of Plato, who lived from 204 to 270 AD. And it was a deliberate attempt to integrate Plato's philosophy with that of Aristotle, the Stoics, and Pythagoras. And a lot of those ideas actually entered into some Christian and Muslim theology. Although the Christian and Muslim views had differences too from the original pagan Greek versions. Another school of ancient Greek philosophy was the Epicureans. They thought that everything is made of material atoms, indivisible particles that don't ever get destroyed, but they kind of combine into new ways and disassemble and then reassemble. So the motion, combination, and separation of atoms explains everything that happens in the world, according to Epicureans. You can probably see how certain aspects of the Stoic view of natural law and the Epicurean view of nature influenced the later scientific view that emerged in the 1600s, which is a kind of materialistic analysis of the universe. However, unlike modern scientific materialism, the Epicureans did believe in gods. They thought that gods are not interacting, though, with the physical world. They're kind of happy, immortal beings who don't really interact miraculously. So they're trying to say that gods are these like ideals or paragons of virtue and wisdom, how to have a good life for humans, but that they don't perform miracles or interact. And they believe that humans actually don't have an afterlife, that the soul is just a material thing in the body, and that when you die, the body together with the soul just disperses. Although they thought that this was actually a relief because it meant that there was no chance you could be in torment or suffer pain in the afterlife. They also believe that knowledge is based on sense perception rather than pure reason. So this just gives you some idea of some of the main ancient Greek philosophical theories and concepts that kind of related to theology and religious belief. And some of these would influence later generations of scholars in the West, including like some of the secular scholars who would study religion, but others got incorporated into Christian, Jewish, and Muslim theology in the Middle Ages. So medieval Christian, Jewish, and Muslim philosophy was heavily influenced by Plato, Aristotle, and Neoplatonism. Opinions really varied. I mean, many members of these religions weren't necessarily aware at all of ancient Greek philosophy, but among the literate or the educated, those who wanted to develop rational expositions and defenses of their religion's theology, many of them drew upon the thought of earlier Greeks, even if they would modify them. So Plato, for example, he was not a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim, so he's going to have a slightly different view of God or theology and other religious beliefs than those later religions would. But there might be certain ideas from Plato that were consistent. So Plato's idea that there was one being, the one or the good, that's like the first cause of everything else, that was influential on later monotheistic theologians. So just a few examples of medieval philosophers who came up with philosophical theologies. Uh, Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as he was known by the Latin West, lived from 1126 to 1198. So he was a Muslim scholar from Cordoba, Spain, a scholar of Sharia or Islamic law. And an example of one of his beliefs is that philosophy and religion are both ways of arriving at truth. So he thought that religion is the way for the many to get to the main truths about the universe and God and the afterlife and so on. But for the educated few, they could supplement that with philosophy. But he thought of them as going together, not being in conflict. An example of a medieval Jewish philosopher was Moses Maimonides, who lived from 1138 to 1204. He wrote a famous book called The Guide for the Perplexed, which discussed difficulties of Aristotle's philosophy for the believer. So at this point in the Middle Ages, Aristotle was a very popular philosopher, including among both Muslim and Jewish and later Christian scholars. But Aristotle had a different theology than you would find in any of those three religions. So, for example, his theory of the creation of the universe, you could say, was different in how it worked with the details than that of the book of Genesis in the Bible, which involves creation out of nothing. So there were differences in some of the theologies and other views of the cosmos between Aristotle's philosophy and monotheistic religions. So Moses Maimonides tried to discuss these difficulties and basically tried to explain how you could make sense of combining Aristotle's main ideas, but with, in his case, making it compatible with Judaism, Orthodox Judaism. So he also emphasized right belief or orthodoxy, not just right behavior or orthopraxy. This is especially significant in the context of Judaism, which tends to focus on defining the commandments or the observances that Jews should obey based on the Torah or the law given to the ancient prophet Moses by God. But unlike many other Jewish rabbis or teachers, Moses Maimonides thought that right belief was also important, not just following the commandments or observances. And he also emphasized the unity and oneness of God. And this, of course, is consistent with Jewish monotheism, but the way he articulates it shows an influence from the earlier Neoplatonists. Thomas Aquinas is a famous example of a medieval Christian philosopher. He lived from 1225 to 1274. One of his major works is the Summa Theologiae, which is a summary or summa of all scholastic philosophy and theology. So it's trying to summarize the philosophy of the schools, the universities run by the Catholic Church in Western Europe at the time, trying to summarize it into one large work. It was basically intended as like a textbook or compendium for students and scholars of the day. He believed that some doctrines of the faith can be proven rationally, such as the existence of God. So he gives famously 5 different ways or arguments for proving the existence of God. But there are other doctrines of the faith, in his case Christianity, that depend on revelation, such as the doctrine of the Trinity, that God has three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the doctrine of the incarnation of Jesus, where God is incarnate through the person of Jesus Christ. Though he thought that the doctrines that depend on revelation, i.e., beliefs revealed in the Gospels and other Christian scriptures, are not contrary to reason. So yeah, as mentioned, his 5 ways were 5 proofs for the existence of God. And some of them you could see an influence of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. This idea that there has to be a first cause of the universe, and that through additional reasons trying to prove that the first cause must have been God. Early modern philosophy is basically covering the period from around 1600 to 1800. These early modern philosophers, although they were still influenced by the ancient and medieval Western philosophers and theologians, they were trying to make a clean break with the philosophy of the schools, or scholasticism. They largely rejected the particular arguments and doctrines of Plato, Aristotle, and medieval philosophy. They sought new foundations for knowledge. They were actually influenced, though, by the ancient Greek schools of the Stoics and the Epicureans, like the Stoic idea of natural laws in nature that can be understood through human reason, and the Epicurean idea that the universe is just a material entity or set of entities, and that everything that happens in the universe can be analyzed in terms of the motion of material particles or corpuscles, basically like atoms and their various combinations. So the early modern philosophers were often critical of Christianity and the Catholic Church, and other traditional religions and religious authorities. So they were trying to use reason and empirical observation to understand reality, although many of them were religious in one way or the other. Rene Descartes, one of the most famous early modern philosophers, was, or at least identified as, a Roman Catholic, but he created a wholly new system of philosophy that was meant to be independent of earlier Catholic scholasticism. So he was known as a rationalist, or he's classified as a rationalist. He's one of these philosophers who believes that knowledge is based on pure reason, in part, especially for its foundational elements, not just on sense experience. So, for example, Descartes used the methodological doubt, or Cartesian doubt, to try to doubt everything he could, to try to find something that was not possible to doubt logically, and that would be a foundation, a secure, rational foundation for all knowledge. So the first thing that he thinks he's able to prove is summarized in the argument, "I think, therefore I am." So if he's trying to doubt everything, even his own existence, the very fact that he's doubting means that he's thinking, and the very fact that he's thinking means that he must exist, at least. So the significance of early modern philosophy, in part, is that it's a break between philosophy and religious ideology. Even the early modern philosophers who were religious, most of them believed in God, for example, but they often parted ways with various other doctrines of Christianity or of the particular church that they were raised in, because by that time there were multiple churches in Europe, including the various Protestant churches, not just Catholicism. So they were trying to create new worldviews independent of religious ideologies. Some of their thinking influenced the early secular and scientific study of religion. So that's the kind of connection there between this period of philosophy and you could say early religious studies. So there were other early modern philosophers classified as empiricists, who believe that knowledge is based on sense experience or sense perception. And also other types of experience, potentially, like your introspection, your awareness of your current conscious states, like being in pain, for example. but they would often emphasize sense experience as the way of learning about the natural world. So a famous example of an empiricist was the English philosopher John Locke. And early modern philosophy was a big influence ideologically on the philosophes, who were philosophers and thinkers of the French Enlightenment during the 1700s. They were a mix, you could say, of rationalists, empiricists, and they had other types of intellectual diversity too. But the common theme of this whole era is trying to create ideologies independent of traditional religious belief, at least to give them independent foundations. Even though, like, Descartes was a Catholic, for example, so he tried to prove the existence of God, the soul, and immortality, but he tried to do so wholly independent of Christian revelation, just by using rational arguments. Modern philosophy, you could say, begins around the year 1800 with the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and continues, depending on how you date it, to the late 19th or late 20th centuries. So Immanuel Kant lived between 1724 to 1804. He was a German philosopher. He critiqued traditional, both empirical and rational, arguments for God's existence. Many of the early modern philosophers, even if they were critical of many beliefs of Christianity or other religions, they often tried to give rational or empirical arguments for the existence of God or some kind of supreme being. Kant himself was a believer. He just thought that the arguments failed. He tried to give his own way of proving God's existence and the immortality of the soul and objective morality, among other things, using what he called transcendental arguments. So looking at the overall structure of human thought and trying to derive, you could say, he said transcendentally, you might say at the meta level, derive certain meta level properties of human thought, which he thought must map on to the nature of reality as well. G.W.F. Hegel was a famous early 19th century philosopher influenced by Kant, as were most other German and other European philosophers of the early 19th century. Hegel lived between 1770 to 1831. He posited an absolute spirit, as it would be translated into English, towards which the universe is evolving through a logical process called a dialectic, which implies a kind of back and forth. A later way of analyzing Hegel's dialectic that's still useful is to use the three terms thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So Hegel thought there was a kind of logical structure to reality, but it unfolded through history as a kind of process of change. According to this later articulation of his view, the first stage is a thesis, and the second stage is the antithesis or opposite of that, but they kind of merge together in the third phase of synthesis to kind of like a higher resolution. So he thought there was a necessary logical structure to the history of humanity, but also the whole universe, and he thought it was all evolving towards absolute spirit, or you could say God, in maybe a less technical Hegelian way. But so it's a unique idea, or it was an original idea in its time, because it's essentially evolutionary, that there is a kind of God that exists and governs the universe, but God doesn't actually exist until, you could say, the end state or the full development of the universe. And the goal of this process of cosmic evolution is mutual recognition of the freedom and equality of all humans and other conscious beings. So Hegel was an idealist, or someone who thought that consciousness or mind, and you can see that revealed in the logical or rational aspect of the dialectic, is fundamentally real or explanatory for the nature of the universe. And he influenced, as well as Kant, like a whole generation of German idealist philosophers in the early 19th century. And again, most of these people would have been critical of Christianity or other religions, but they have their own kind of like vaguely religious or theological counterparts in their philosophies. A later 19th century philosopher is Arthur Schopenhauer, who lived between 1788 and 1860. And He was not really an idealist like Hegel and the earlier generation of German philosophers. He thought of the world as will and representation. So will is non-rational, but also non-empirical. You can't see it with the senses. It's the inner essence of reality, though. Representation is something that can be detected through the senses and articulated rationally, which is the outer manifestation of reality. So will is kind of like this inner subjective impulse or process, and representation is the outer physical and rationally explainable aspect of reality. So this is somewhat removed, to be frank, from religious studies. But the reason why it's worth going through this is because the ideology of Europe and the West, and eventually the rest of the world, was becoming increasingly secular and non-religious during these periods of early modern and then modern philosophy. So from 1600 to the year 2000, and the secularization of many of the scholars and the elites contributed to the development of scientific and other secular study of religion. So for Schopenhauer, there is no God or rational order or purpose inherent in the cosmos, because the inner nature of the cosmos is will, which is non-rational. It defies a rational order. And the wills of different beings are in a constant state of striving and struggling, which is also painful and suffering because it involves death and destruction. Like think of animals competing with each other for survival. Um, However, Schopenhauer thought that the suffering of the human will, at least, can be escaped through aesthetic contemplation, contemplating the beauty of representation from a kind of detached or removed perspective. And I think he kind of saw this as analogous to like things like Buddhist meditation, but other forms of religious contemplation too. But rather than contemplating God or nirvana from a Buddhist perspective, it was contemplating in a detached manner these kind of like aesthetic or sensory properties of the world as representation. Friedrich Nietzsche was a famous late 19th century German philosopher who was famously an atheist. He lived from 1844 to 1900. He was influenced by Schopenhauer. He thought the main reality and driver of the cosmos is what he called the will to power inherent in all beings. And he's famous for the phrase, God is dead. So he thought that there's different ways you can articulate this, but one of the ways is that modern science seems to reveal a godless cosmos. So there don't seem to be miracles. The world is made of material stuffs and physical energy, like electromagnetism, and it follows natural laws, but there's no miracles. There's no place for divine intervention or even a divine order or pattern in the cosmos. So instead, the only thing that really exists is the will to power. The way forward for humans, according to Nietzsche, is striving towards power and greatness. So he also thought that the best humans should strive to transcend their very humanity and to become Übermenschen, which you could translate as overmen or transhumans, perhaps. And so you can see Nietzsche's ideology is maybe the most explicitly anti-religious. He actually had great critiques of Judaism and Christianity because he thought they created this ideal world that doesn't exist, and that they also downplayed material power in favor of spiritual realities like the heavenly kingdom and Christianity, and that he thought this was just a deception and weakened people. So a lot of these philosophers in the modern period would be like explicitly anti-Christian or otherwise anti-religious in their ideology. By the way, that's a picture of Nietzsche on the slide. So moving on to the 20th century, some of the most influential theories on religious studies include critical theory and postmodernism. Critical theory dates to the post-World War II era, so basically in the 1950s and after. You can distinguish between critical theory in the broader sense, so we can indicate this by speaking of critical theory without capitalizing the first two letters of each word. So just the generic or broader sense of critical theory is seeking to understand, expose, and critique power structures. But this broader sense derives from a more particular ideology, critical theory in capital letters, so to speak, of the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School, named after Frankfurt, Germany, consisted of Western Marxists or communists who used Karl Marx's analysis sort of format or method of power dynamics to analyze not just economic power relations, but power structures in culture and society generally. So they didn't limit themselves to like a conventional Marxist analysis of the exploitation of the proletariat or the working class by the capitalist class. They look for broader aspects of power dynamics throughout culture and society. And they ended up being very influential on, I guess you could say, Marxist and post-Marxist and other leftists and progressive in the West and around the world. Many of them moved to the United States and had students there as well. The picture shows Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, two of the most important figures in the Frankfurt School. And subsequently, these ideas were kind of taken up throughout the social sciences and humanities, including a lot of religious studies scholars. So they might try to use them to critique traditional religions in terms of a kind of Marxist style exploitation. But it wouldn't necessarily be a purely economic exploitation. Religion might have other power dynamics going on there as well. But the assumption of the Frankfurt School is usually there's an oppressed class that's being exploited by a dominant elite, with the kind of implication that the elite should be overthrown or destroyed and that the oppressed class should be liberated. Postmodernism takes a critical stance towards grand narratives about the nature of reality. So they often deny, or they typically deny, that there is any single objective theory or story of the nature of reality or of human society. They're often described as adopting a hermeneutic or method interpretation of suspicion, so being suspicious of theories and grand narratives. Postmodernists believe that every perspective is biased. There's no real such thing as a detached, impartial, objective scholar. So this has been very influential in religious studies and other academic disciplines. This idea that allegedly objective scholars of religion would really just impose their own philosophy or ideology on what they're studying, usually for the sake of power. So because postmodernism also talks about the use of power in creating narratives and theories, it's often taken together, or it's kind of corollary or logical implication of critical theory. Michel Foucault in the picture was a famous postmodernist. So these have been very influential in religious studies, and I think within the broader culture nowadays. It's possible their influence is starting to wane a little bit, but they're still quite prominent. And postmodernism, just to situate it historically, can be regarded as developing in the late 1960s, but especially in the 1970s. So there are objections to both critical critical theory and postmodernism. One is if you're trying to argue for the postmodern hermeneutic of suspicion, and you're trying to say that there is no such thing as an objective scholar, that seems to lend itself to self-refutation, i.e., the postmodernists themselves have their own grand narrative about how other narratives are constructed, and that there's always this power dynamic involved, and that there's no objective reality. But denying objective reality is itself a claim about the nature of reality or of truth. And this seems to be self-refuting or self-undermining, like the phrase hoisted with his own petard. That is, you're trying to light a bomb to blow up someone else's gate, but you also blow up yourself. Because if this is correct, it would also undermine any argument for postmodernism itself. So why should we even believe it if it is just another narrative and it's not objectively true? In fact, I think a more reasonable way, we can actually gain insights from critical theory and postmodernism. It's probably true that there are a lot of ideologies and other things in the culture and in religion that are driven in part by power dynamics, and that a lot of people are biased by their own ideology or narrative, but also that they may have a kind of incentive in the particulars of what they believe if doing so helps them get power. But at the very least, we should see that bias is not all or nothing. It's a matter of degree. So scholars can be more or less biased. If this were not the case, we wouldn't even be able to identify the existence of bias or power dynamics or narratives in the first place. In order to assert that there is such a thing as structures of power, that there is such a thing as oppression, that there is such a thing as a bias or even a particular narrative or theory, you have to believe the things you are talking about are objectively real, that you can make objectively true propositions about them, and that you can have some degree of objectively justified knowledge of them. Otherwise, postmodernism, and you could say critical theory too, would just become incoherent. So it's more reasonable to sort of agree with some of the points that critical theory and postmodernism are trying to say without going to the extreme that they do, and just realize that because it's possible to be less biased, you can use that to leverage your way up to a better and better view of reality, including the nature of religion or the nature of the universe itself. Critical theory and postmodernist theorists also themselves historically often abuse their power, such as within academia, to purge scholars or ideologies that they don't like. Oddly, many postmodernists and critical theorists, they do have political ideologies of a leftist variety, sometimes Marxist or just influenced by Karl Marx. And nowadays, there's a lot of ideologies about racial justice and things like that. But they treat these political ideologies as if they were objective, at least in terms of the way that they act, and often try to impose them on others. It's because they sincerely believe that they are, the correct theories of social justice, for example. But if we accept their analysis of power or of grand narratives, why should we accept their political ideology? Again, it would be self-undermining. So there's a kind of bizarre logical incoherence, I would argue, towards critical theory and postmodernism. So I would sort of counsel again a kind of nuanced view. We don't have to reject them completely, but neither should we agree with them completely either. Um, in terms of the philosophy of religion, this developed in the 20th century. The field that we nowadays call philosophy of religion is a subfield of analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy focuses on the logical analysis of concepts, propositions, and arguments to solve philosophical problems. And it kind of grows out of the development of modern symbolic logic, making logic into a formal system developed by mathematical logicians such as Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell in the late 19th century. And other influences on analytic philosophy were people like G.E. Moore, an English philosopher who emphasized common sense and reason to solve philosophical problems. He was a great critic of the German idealism and other types of philosophy coming out of Germany and other parts of Europe in the 19th century, which I guess he thought were overly theoretical, ideological, couldn't really be proven, like Hegel's theories, for example. Moore wrote on ethics, metaethics, or the nature of ethical truth and knowledge and so on, epistemology, theory of knowledge, and metaphysics, theory of being. So he's one of the founders of analytic philosophy. Now, the early generations of analytic philosophers didn't typically write on religion, but later generations did in the 20th century, mid to late 20th century especially. So you could define philosophy of religion as the philosophical study of the meaning and nature of religion and of the truth and justification of religious beliefs. So unlike religious studies in general, philosophy of religion is trying to evaluate the beliefs of religions to see if they're true, for example. it does try to evaluate, critique, or argue for them. And so it's not really adopting that methodological agnosticism that some of the social sciences approach to religious studies do. By the way, that's Bertrand Russell in the picture on the slide. Section 1.9, Theology and Religious Studies. Theology can be defined as theory of God or the gods, or any attempt to understand, articulate, or defend religious beliefs. So you can see how it overlaps with philosophy. Anselm of Canterbury is a famous example of a medieval Christian theologian. He lived from 1033 to 1109, and he famously characterized theology as, quote, faith seeking understanding, unquote. So this idea that religious faith could sort of go along with the rational inquiry side of theology. The traditional academic approaches to the study of religion, like in anthropology and sociology, took pains to distinguish themselves. They were eager to differentiate themselves from theology because theologians would often be of a religious tradition, and they would maybe try to critique the views of other religions as well as to define and defend the views of their own religion. But other scholars have argued that theological approaches to religion can be helpful or even essential just to understanding it. So like, for instance, in order to understand a religion like Christianity, even from just a secular or scholarly perspective, it's good to know what their theology is. So what is the relation between theology and religious studies? Um, the theology understands a religion using the terms and formulations used by members of the religion itself. So it tends to have the perspective of believers or members of the religion, whereas that's not generally true of religious studies. And you can also compare and contrast the theological approach to understanding religion versus other approaches, like the scientific study of religion. If you have to characterize it, it tends to be a reductive and quantitative. Science often tries to analyze more complex structures into their underlying causal components. You can look at that as a type of reductive analysis, and to develop equations that can be used to precisely model quantitatively the systems that they're analyzing. And to a certain extent, you could do that with the scientific study of religion. Although that would often be, in terms of involving your models, they would be statistical in nature. Phenomenological approaches to the study of religion. This is from the word phenomenology, which means theory of the appearances. So it's talking about the subjective or qualitative aspects of our experience. And these approaches are not conventionally scientific, but they might provide another dimension of our understanding of something, including religion, by emphasizing the descriptive and experiential side to these religions. Like, how do believers or members of the religion experience reality? In terms of the theological analysis of religion or study of religion, those would center questions of the meaning, significance, worldview, way of life, and the truth of religious beliefs as understood by members of the religion. So it's like the phenomenological one. It's more of like an internal or an emic perspective, but it also has this rational definition, analysis, and proof aspect to it. So there has been an influence of theology on religious studies, according to some scholars. So the current contemporary scholar Timothy Fitzgerald, for example, argued that the secular study of religion, i.e. religious studies, has always been so-called tainted by theology. So according to Fitzgerald, the secular study of religion developed in a world where Christianity dominated, often with a particular kind of liberal Christian theology. So he's thinking especially of earlier generations of religious studies scholars, some of whom may have been religious, but also they may have just been working within a broader culture that influenced their assumptions, thinking, or analysis. So I'm not sure that the theological influence on religious studies is always bad or a taint, but I think there's definitely some truth to Fitzgerald's analysis, and you can provide historical examples of theological and philosophical influence on earlier generations of religious studies scholars. So if you want to look at liberal Protestant theology as it developed, especially in the 20th century, Protestants, they broke from the Catholic Church in Western Europe in the early 1500s. One of their criticisms of Catholic Christianity, they had many, was the hierarchy of the church, including the existence of a supreme bishop or pope who had authority over all Christians. And some Protestant reformers also critiqued the very existence of bishops or leaders of Christian religious communities in a city or other region. So this historical Protestant tendency to critique hierarchy, also ceremonies, like some Protestants were critiquing traditional ritual, liturgy, or other ceremonies of Catholic Christianity or of traditions. A lot of Protestants were trying to base their understanding of Christianity just on the Bible or Scripture rather than on other traditions that had developed alongside it. So how did this relate to religious studies? Well, a lot of the earlier generations of religious studies scholars seem to implicitly accept the Protestant idea that the heart of religion is or should be scriptures or texts and faith, the faith of the believers. Many Protestants also have a soteriology or theory of salvation that emphasizes faith in God rather than any external action or work as the basis for salvation. So how would this influence the study of religion? Well, if you're studying a religion like Buddhism and you're influenced by this worldview, maybe you'll just focus on the Pali Canon or the Buddhist scriptures rather than other dimensions of the religion like their traditions and ceremonies and so on. And then another example of this ideological influence from theology, in the Enlightenment period, even though a lot of the scholars were critical of the Catholic Church and Christianity generally, many or most were deists, so they believed in a God that creates the universe but does not intervene miraculously, does not break the laws of nature, that God creates a rational order or structure of the universe, like the idea of the divine logos in ancient Stoic philosophy. And this could influence the idea of earlier generations of religious studies scholars that belief in miracles by religions is somehow silly or problematic or shouldn't really be taken seriously or kind of degrades the dignity of the religion as opposed to more abstract theological concepts. Romanticism was an ideology that started in Europe in the early 1800s, kind of late 1700s, but just after the Enlightenment. And it kind of grew out of the Enlightenment, but it tended to react against the idea that reason and sense experience are the basis for knowledge and of uncovering reality. They emphasize the role of emotion and spirit in human nature, and that they are more fundamental than reason. So this idea also colored some later generations of scholars' thinking, where they might idealize certain non-rational ways of knowing found in religions. Idealism is a type of philosophy that developed really out of Kant's theory, and especially that of Hegel and other early 19th century German philosophers. And they believe that mind or consciousness is more fundamental than matter or physical energy in reality. So if you go back to the 1800s, this was a very pervasive ideology among a lot of scholars, and they would often think that there was kind of a common view of a consciousness that could maybe extend throughout reality or explain it. And these scholars would often look for confirmation of this kind of worldview or ideology in the religions they were studying and highlight interpretations of the religions that kind of gelled with that idealistic philosophy. And they might try to argue that there was a kind of common element of idealism to the world's major religions. And that's kind of connected to the idea of perennialism, which is the view that there's a single religious realm or reality that underlays all religions, and that it just finds different expression in different religions. Um, and current generation of religious studies scholars tend to be critical of all of these various ideologies or implicit theologies. Perennialism, I would say, went out of fashion starting probably around the 1970s or 80s. But yeah, it's pretty out of fashion today among religious studies scholars who would emphasize the genuine diversity of religious theologies, perspectives, and ideologies. Just because these various theologies and philosophies are out of fashion today doesn't mean they're wrong, right? But it is important to realize how these kind of philosophical perspective of scholars themselves can bias their scholarship on religion or filter it in some ways. It doesn't make it necessarily worthless, but it can make their analysis, kind of incomplete or misleading. Mircea Eliade, a famous 20th century religious studies scholar, had a religious worldview of sorts. So he's worth bringing up because all of this sort of critique of the role of theology or religious and quasi-religious belief systems, being wary of their influence on religious studies scholarship, it doesn't necessarily mean that religious studies scholars are going to be biased in their work worthless if they are religious. And I think Eliade, his view of the sacred and the profane, for example, is still very influential and taken seriously. And it's not regarded as necessarily undermining the credibility of all of his theories, just that he himself had certain religious beliefs. And then we can talk about theology and religious studies as academic disciplines. Their relation does vary from country to country. A few examples. In Germany, theology, whether Catholic or Protestant Christian, is always separate from the secular study of religion in terms of the organization of German universities. So like theology would be a different department, for example. In the UK, the United Kingdom, traditional universities only started to accept non-Anglican, non-Church of England Christians in the mid-19th century. And so there was this tradition of Anglican Church of England theology as being a part of the university mission. But nowadays, theology is taught in the UK from a generic non-sectarian point of view, so not exclusively Anglican. And seminaries or schools for priests and clergy that study sectarian theology, that would be theology of their own particular church or sect, are generally entirely separate institutions from the rest of the British university system. In the United States, theology departments are generally separate from religious studies departments, but some theology departments also have an active religious studies component. Section 1.10, New Outlooks on the Study of Religion. In the final section, we're going to look at some recent developments, including of internet culture, that kind of relate to religious studies. So, a recent trend, the last few years, even like last 5 to 10, has been expanding critiques of the academic study of religion. Some of these people are scholars, many of them are just sort of like public intellectuals. But some examples of the type of people I'm thinking of here are Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau. Jordan Peterson is kind of infamous. He's a Canadian psychoanalyst, influenced by the psychologist Carl Jung that we discussed previously. But he also has a lot to say about religious beliefs and stories that has a different take on them than what you would traditionally find in religious studies or the scientific study of religion. Another example would be Jonathan Pageau, who's an Orthodox Christian icon maker, but who has a lot to say about religious symbolism, especially within his own tradition of Orthodox Christianity, but a lot of it applies to other religions as well. So some common features of these kind of figures, they tend to be very active on the internet or podcasts. So kind of like popular media, but they also may write books. Like Jordan Peterson has books he's written, for example. And they're often very hostile to traditional academic theories that have influenced fields of study like religious studies, such as critical theory and postmodernism, and other theories of the academic study of religion. I think they tend to look at the academic study of religion as being very ideological or theoretical and kind of not really capturing the way the religions are understood from within. And to be fair, I think there's a lot of truth to these critiques from Peterson and Pajot. I would say personally, I'm more of a fan of Pajot's takes on things, but they make some fair points, I think, against religious studies and academic study of religion generally. Critical theory and postmodernism, for example, do seem unable to understand religions the way they understand themselves. Like if you're a postmodernist, and you think there is no such thing as objective reality, it's very hard to understand or accept religious views in a way that would allow you to take them seriously. So they never consider the possibility that any religion is actually or could be true, for example. That's beyond the pale. So people like Peterson and Pajot, in contrast, would stress the legitimacy of religious ways of understanding, and they focus on the role of symbols and their meaning and the continued relevance of religious traditions and ways of understanding the world. So they're not just these pre-modern holdovers. They're still kind of with us today and still powerful and meaningful. Another example of a recent approach to religious studies is mixing religious studies scholarship with public outreach. Some contemporary scholars of religion focus much of their career on communicating the findings of their field to the public, often via social media platforms like YouTube. An example is Andrew M. Henry, who has the Religion for Breakfast YouTube channel. So this is a great way of kind of making religious studies scholarship accessible and available and relevant to the broader community and world. I think a fair critique of a lot of modern academic scholarship is that it's only read by a small number of scholars in the discipline, if that, and that it's kind of cut off from the rest of society. And so even if it is generating some genuine knowledge or insights, it's just not really shared with anyone, and so it doesn't really have much of a function in terms of society or humanity. And another trend is mixing scholarship with what you could call advocacy of a religion or practice of it. Some scholars of religion are also religious practitioners nowadays to some degree or in certain ways, which gives them both an insider and an outsider perspective to the religion. So this is not wholly new, but it does seem to be more common and noticeable. And in the past, it would have often been regarded as a mark against your scholarship if you had any actual belief in religion or any actual religious practice, because the idea might be it would just bias your perspective, you wouldn't be truly scientific, and so on. Some of these scholar practitioners also reach the public directly via YouTube or other social media platforms. So the examples that come to mind for me are Justin Sledge, who's a scholar of mysticism and the occult with a YouTube channel that has a lot of information related to religious studies, but also philosophy and mysticism and occult studies. And Angela Puka, who's a scholar of the occult, who I'm not sure if she's a practitioner as well. She might be, but she seems kind of at least sympathetic to the worldviews of occult practitioners. And the word occult here I'm using to refer to mainly like ritual magic practices, like those connected with Hermeticism or the philosophy based on the teachings of the alleged figure Hermes Trismegistus, which influenced medieval Christian and Muslim philosophy and alchemy and mysticism. So there's a lot more to be said about all that, but if you want to learn more, you could probably just go to their channels and find out. So that finally concludes our introduction to religion and religious studies. Next up will be part 2, indigenous religions.